Chapter 41 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 41. From the workshop of the Golden Key there issued forth a tinkling sound, so merry and good-humoured that it suggested the idea of some one working blithely, and made quite pleasant music. No man who hammered on at a dull monotonous duty could have brought such cheerful notes from steel and iron. None but a chirping, healthy, honest-hearted fellow, who made the best of everything, and felt kindly towards everybody, could have done it for an instant. He might have been a coppersmith, and still been musical. If he had sat in a jolting waggon full of rods of iron, it seemed as if he would have brought some harmony out of it. Tink, 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 clear as a silver bell, and audible at every pause of the street's harsher noises, as though it said, "I don't care. Nothing puts me out. I'm resolved to be happy." Women scolded, children squalled, heavy carts went rumbling by. Horrible cries proceeded from the lungs of hawkers. Still it struck in again, no higher, no lower, no louder, no softer, not thrusting itself on people's notice a bit the more for having been outdone by louder sounds. Tink, 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 tink. It was a perfect embodiment of the still small voice, free from all cold, hoarseness, huskiness, or unhealthiness of any kind. Foot passengers slackened their pace, and were disposed to linger near it. Neighbours who had got up splenetic that morning felt good humour stealing on them as they heard it, and by degrees became quite sprightly. Mothers danced their babies to its ringing, still the same magical tink, tink, tink came gaily from the workshop of the Golden Key. Who but the locksmith could have made such music? A gleam of sun shining through the unsashed window, and chequering the dark workshop with a broad patch of light, fell full upon him, as though attracted by his sunny heart. There he stood, working at his anvil, his face all radiant with exercise and gladness, his sleeves turned up, his wig pushed off his shining forehead, the easiest, freest, happiest man in all the world. Beside him sat a sleek cat, purring and winking in the light, and falling every now and then into an idle doze, as from excess of comfort. Toby looked on from a tall bench hard by, one beaming smile from his broad nut-brown face down to the slack-baked buckles in his shoes. The very locks that hung around had something jovial in their rust, and seemed like gouty gentlemen of hearty natures disposed to joke on their infirmities. There was nothing surly or severe in the whole scene. It seemed impossible that any one of the innumerable keys could fit a churlish strong-box or a prison door. Cellars of beer and wine, rooms where there were fires, books, gossip, and cheering laughter, these were their proper sphere of action. Places of distrust and cruelty and restraint they would have left quadruple locked for ever. Tink, tink, tink. The locksmith paused at last, and wiped his brow. The silence roused the cat, who, jumping softly down, crept to the door, and watched with tiger eyes a bird-cage in an opposite window. Gabriel lifted Toby to his mouth, and took a hearty draught. Then, as he stood upright, with his head flung back, and his portly chest thrown out, you would have seen that Gabriel's lower man was clothed in military gear. Glancing at the wall beyond, there might have been espied, hanging on their several pegs, a cap and feather, broadsword, sash, and coat of scarlet, which any man, learned in such matters, would have known from their make and pattern to the uniform of a sergeant in the Royal East London Volunteers. As the locksmith put his mug down, empty, on the bench whence it had smiled on him before, he glanced at these articles with a laughing eye, and looking at them with his head a little on one side, as though he would get them all into a focus, said, leaning on his hammer, "Time was, now I remember, when I was like to run mad with the desire to wear a coat of that colour. If any one, except my father, had called me a fool for my pains, how I should have fired and fumed. But what a fool I must have been, surely.
Ah, sighed Mrs Varden, who had entered unobserved. A fool indeed. A man at your time of life, Varden, should know better now.
Why, what a ridiculous woman you are, Martha, said the locksmith, turning round with a smile.
Certainly, replied Mrs V. with great demureness. Of course I am. I know that, Varden, thank you.
I mean, began the locksmith.
Yes, said his wife, I know what you mean. You speak quite plain enough to be understood, Varden. It's very kind of you to adapt yourself to my capacity, I am sure. Oh, Martha,
rejoined the locksmith, don't take offence at nothing. I mean, how strange it is of you to run down volunteering, when it's done to defend you and all the other women, and our own fireside and everybody else's in case of need.
It's unchristian, cried Mrs Varden, shaking her head.
Unchristian? said the locksmith. Why, what the devil?
Mrs Varden looked at the ceiling, as in expectation that the consequence of his profanity would be the immediate descent of the four-post bedstead on the second floor, together with the best sitting-room on the first. But no visible judgment occurring, she heaved a deep sigh, and begged her husband, in a tone of resignation, to go on, and by all means to blaspheme as much as possible, because he knew she liked it. The locksmith did for a moment seem disposed to gratify her, but he gave a great gulp, and mildly rejoined, I was going to say, what on earth do you call it unchristian for? Which would be most unchristian, Martha, to sit quietly down and let our houses be sacked by a foreign army, or to turn out like men and drive 'em off? Shouldn't I be a nice sort of a Christian if I crept into a corner of my own chimney and looked on while a parcel of whiskered savages bore off Dolly, or you? When he said, or you, Mrs Varden, despite herself, relaxed into a smile. There was something complimentary in the idea. In such a state of things as that, indeed, she simpered.
As that? Repeated the locksmith. Well, that would be the state of things directly. Even Miggs would go. Some black tambourine player with a great turban on would be bearing her off, and unless the tambourine player was proof against kicking and scratching, it's my belief he'd have the worst of it. I'd forgive the tambourine player. I wouldn't have him interfered with on any account. Poor fellow.
And here the locksmith laughed again so heartily that tears came into his eyes, much to Mrs Varden's indignation, who thought the capture of so sound a Protestant and estimable a private character as Miggs by a pagan negro, a circumstance too shocking and awful for contemplation. The picture Gabriel had drawn indeed threatened serious consequences, and would indubitably have led to them, but luckily at that moment a light footstep crossed the threshold, and Dolly, running in, threw her arms round her old father's neck and hugged him tight.
Here she is at last, cried Gabriel. And how well you look, doll, and how late you are, my darling.
How well she looked? Well, why, if he had exhausted every laudatory adjective in the dictionary, it wouldn't have been praise enough. When and where was there ever such a plump, roguish, comely, bright-eyed, enticing, bewitching, captivating, maddening little puss in all this world as Dolly? What was the Dolly of 5 years ago to the Dolly of that day? How many coachmakers, saddlers, cabinet-makers, and professors of other useful arts had deserted their fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, and most of all their cousins, for the love of her? How many unknown gentlemen, supposed to be of mighty fortunes, if not titles, had waited round the corner after dark, and tempted Miggs the incorruptible with golden guineas to deliver offers of marriage folded up in love letters! How many disconsolate fathers and substantial tradesmen had waited on the locksmith for the same purpose, with dismal tales of how their sons had lost their appetites, and taken to shut themselves up in dark bedrooms, and wandering in desolate suburbs with pale faces, and all because of Dolly Varden's loveliness and cruelty! How many young men in all previous times of unprecedented steadiness had turned suddenly wild and wicked for the same reason, and in an ecstasy of unrequited love taken to wrench off door-knockers and invert the boxes of rheumatic watchmen! How had she recruited the king's service, both by sea and land, through rendering desperate his loving subjects between the ages of 18 and 25? How many young ladies had publicly professed, with tears in their eyes, that for their tastes she was much too short, too tall, too bold, too cold, too stout, too thin, too fair, too dark, too everything but handsome? How many old ladies, taking counsel together, had thanked heaven their daughters were not like her, and had hoped she might come to no harm, and had thought she would come to no good, and had wondered what people saw in her, and had arrived at the conclusion that she was going off in her looks, or had never come on in them, and that she was a thorough imposition and a popular mistake. And yet here was this same Dolly Varden, so whimsical and hard to please that she was Dolly Varden still, all smiles and dimples and pleasant looks, and caring no more for the 50 or 60 young fellows who at the very moment were breaking their hearts to marry her, than if so many oysters had been crossed in love and opened afterwards. Dolly hugged her father, as has been already stated, and having hugged her mother also, accompanied both into the little parlour, where the cloth was already laid for dinner, and where Miss Miggs, a trifle more rigid and bony than of yore, received her with a sort of hysterical gasp, intended for a smile. Into the hands of that young virgin she delivered her bonnet and walking dress, all of a dreadful, artful, and designing kind, and then said with a laugh which rivalled the locksmith's music, "How glad I always am to be at home again!" "And how glad we always are, Doll," said her father, putting back the dark hair from her sparkling eyes, "to have you at home. Give me a kiss." If there had been anybody of the male kind there to see her do it, but there was not, it was a mercy. "I don't like your being at the Warren," said the locksmith. "I can't bear to have you out of my sight. And what is the news over yonder, Doll?" "What news there is, I think you know already," replied his daughter. "I am sure you do, though." "Aye?" cried the locksmith. "What's that?" "Oh, come, come," said Dolly. "You know very well. I want you to tell me why Mr Haredale, oh, how gruff he is again, to be sure, has been away from home for some days past, and why he is travelling about. We know he is travelling because of his letters, without telling his own niece why or wherefore." "Miss Emma doesn't want to know, I'll swear," returned the locksmith. "I don't know that," said Dolly, "but I do at any rate. Do tell me, why is he so secret, and what is this ghost story which nobody is to tell Miss Emma, and which seems to be mixed up with his going away? Now I see you know, by your colouring so." "What the story means, or is, or has to do with it, I know no more than you, my dear," returned the locksmith, "except that it's some foolish fear of little Solomon's, which has indeed no meaning in it, I suppose. As to Mr Haredale's journey, he goes, as I believe—" "Yes," said Dolly. "As I believe," resumed the locksmith, pinching her cheek, "on business, Doll. What it may be is quite another matter. Read Bluebeard, and don't be too curious, pet. It's no business of yours or mine, depend upon that, and here's dinner, which is much more to the purpose." Dolly might have remonstrated against this summary dismissal of the subject, notwithstanding the appearance of dinner, but at the mention of Bluebeard, Mrs Varden interposed, protesting she could not find it in her conscience to sit tamely by and hear her child recommended to peruse the adventures of a Turk and Mussulman, far less of a fabulous Turk, which she considered that potentate to be. She held that, in such stirring and tremendous times as those in which they lived, it would be much more to the purpose if Dolly became a regular subscriber to the Thunderer, where she would have an opportunity of reading Lord George Gordon's speeches word for word, which would be a greater comfort and solace to her than 150 Bluebeards ever could impart. She appealed in support of this proposition to Miss Miggs, then in waiting, who said that indeed the peace of mind she had derived from the perusal of that paper generally, but especially of one article of the very last week as ever was, entitled Great Britain Drenched in Gore, exceeded all belief. The same composition, she added, had also wrought such a comforting effect on the mind of a married sister of hers, then resident at Golden Lion Court, No. 27, second bell handle on the right-hand door-post, that, being in a delicate state of health, and in fact expecting an addition to her family, she had been seized with fits directly after its perusal, and had raved of the Inquisition ever since, to the great improvement of her husband and friends. Miss Miggs went on to say that she would recommend all those whose hearts were hardened to hear Lord George themselves, whom she commended first, in respect of his steady Protestantism, then of his oratory, then of his eyes, then of his nose, then of his legs, and lastly of his figure generally, which she looked upon as fit for any statue, prince, or angel, to which sentiment Mrs Varden fully subscribed. Mrs Varden, having cut in, looked at a box upon the mantel-shelf, painted in imitation of a very red brick dwelling-house, with a yellow roof, having at top a real chimney, down which voluntary subscribers dropped their silver, gold, or pence into the parlour, and on the door the counterfeit presentment of a brass plate, whereon was legibly inscribed Protestant Association, and looking at it said that it was to her a source of poignant misery to think that Varden never had, of all his substance, dropped anything into that temple, save once in secret, as she afterwards discovered, 2 fragments of tobacco pipe, which she hoped would not be put down to his last account. That Dolly, she was grieved to say, was no less backward in her contributions, better loving, as it seemed, to purchase ribbons and such gauds than to encourage the great cause than in such heavy tribulation, and that she did entreat her father she much feared could not be moved, not to despise, but imitate the bright example of Miss Miggs, who flung her wages, as it were, into the very countenance of the Pope, and bruised his features with her quarter's money.
"Oh, Mim," said Miggs, "don't allude to that. I'd no intentions, Mim, that nobody should know. Such sacrifices as I can make are quite a widow's mite. It's all I have,"
cried Miggs, with a great burst of tears, for with her they never came on by degrees.
"But it's made up to be in other ways. It's well made up."
This was quite true, though not perhaps in the sense that Miggs intended, as she never failed to keep her self-denial full in Mrs Varden's view. It drew forth so many gifts of caps and gowns and other articles of dress, that upon the whole the red brick house was perhaps the best investment for her small capital she could possibly have hit upon, returning her interest at the rate of 7 or 8% in money, and 50 at least in personal repute and credit.
"You needn't cry, Miggs," said Mrs Varden, herself in tears. "You needn't be ashamed of it, though your poor mistress is on the same side."
Miggs howled at this remark in a peculiarly dismal way, and said she knowed that master hated her, that it was a dreadful thing to live in families and have dislikes, and not give satisfactions, that to make divisions was a thing she could not abear to think of, neither could her feelings let her do it, that if it was master's wishes as she and him should part, it was best they should part, and she hoped he might be the happier for it, and always wished him well, and that he might find somebody as would meet his dispositions. It would be a hard trial, she said, to part from such a missus, but she could meet any suffering when her conscience told her she was in the rights, and therefore she was willing even to go that lengths. She did not think, she added, that she could long survive the separations, but, as she was hated and looked upon unpleasant, perhaps her dying as soon as possible would be the best endings for all parties. With this affecting conclusion, Miss Miggs shed more tears and sobbed abundantly.
"Can you bear this, Varden?"
said his wife in a solemn voice, laying down her knife and fork.
"Why, not very well, my dear," rejoined the locksmith, "but I try to keep my temper."
"Don't let there be words on my account, Mim," sobbed Miggs. "It's much the best that we should part. I wouldn't stay, oh gracious me, and make dissensions, not for annual gold mine and found in tea and sugar."
Lest the reader should be at any loss to discover the cause of Miss Miggs's deep emotion, it may be whispered apart that, happening to be listening, as her custom sometimes was, when Gabriel and his wife conversed together, she had heard the locksmith's joke relative to the foreign black who played the tambourine, and bursting with the spiteful feelings which the taunt awoke in her fair breast, exploded in the manner we have witnessed. Matters having now arrived at a crisis, the locksmith, as usual, and for the sake of peace and quietness, gave in.
"What are you crying for, girl?" he said. "What's the matter with you? What are you talking about hatred for? I don't hate you. I don't hate anybody. Dry your eyes and make yourself agreeable in heaven's name, and let us all be happy while we can."
The allied powers, deeming it good generalship to consider this a sufficient apology on the part of the enemy, and confession of having been in the wrong, did dry their eyes and take it in good part. Miss Miggs observed that she bore no malice, no, not to her greatest foe, whom she rather loved the more indeed, the greater persecution she sustained. Mrs Varden approved of this meek and forgiving spirit in high terms, and incidentally declared, as a closing article of agreement, that Dolly should accompany her to the Clerkenwell branch of the association that very night. This was an extraordinary instance of her great prudence and policy, having had this end in view from the first, and entertaining a secret misgiving that the locksmith, who was bold when Dolly was in question, would object. She had backed Miss Miggs up to this point in order that she might have him at a disadvantage. The manoeuvre succeeded so well that Gabriel only made a wry face, and with the warning he had just had fresh in his mind, did not dare to say one word. The difference ended, therefore, in Miggs being presented with a gown by Mrs Varden, and a half-a-crown by Dolly, as if she had eminently distinguished herself in the paths of morality and goodness. Mrs V., according to custom, expressed her hope that Varden would take a lesson from what had passed, and learn more generous conduct for the time to come. And the dinner being now cold, and nobody's appetite very much improved by what had passed, they went on with it, as Mrs Varden said, like Christians. As there was to be a grand parade of the Royal East London Volunteers that afternoon, the locksmith did no more work, but sat down comfortably with his pipe in his mouth and his arm round his pretty daughter's waist, looking lovingly on Mrs V. from time to time, and exhibiting from the crown of his head to the sole of his foot one smiling surface of good humour. And to be sure, when it was time to dress him in his regimentals, and Dolly, hanging about him in all kinds of graceful winning ways, helped to button and buckle and brush him up and get him into one of the tightest coats that ever was made by mortal tailor, he was the proudest father in all England.
"What a handy jade it is!" said the locksmith to Mrs Varden, who stood by with folded hands, rather proud of her husband too, while Miggs held his cap and sword at arm's length, as if mistrusting that the latter might run someone through the body of its own accord. "But never marry a soldier, Doll, my dear?"
Dolly didn't ask why not, or say a word, indeed, but stooped her head down very low to tie his sash.
"I never wear this dress," said honest Gabriel, "but I think of poor Joe Willet. I loved Joe. He was always a favourite of mine. Poor Joe! Dear heart, my girl, don't tie me in so tight."
Dolly laughed, not like herself at all, the strangest little laugh that could be, and held her head down lower still.
Poor Joe, resumed the locksmith, muttering to himself. I always wish he had come to me. I might have made it up between them if he had. Old John made a great mistake in his way of acting by that lad. A great mistake. Have you nearly tied that sash, my dear?
What an ill-made sash it was! There it was, loose again and trailing on the ground. Dolly was obliged to kneel down and recommence at the beginning.
"Never mind young Willet, Varden," said his wife, frowning. "You might find someone more deserving to talk about, I think."
Miss Miggs gave a great sniff to the same effect.
Nay, Martha, cried the locksmith, don't let us bear too hard upon him. If the lad is dead indeed, we'll deal kindly by his memory.
"A runaway and a vagabond," said Mrs Varden.
Miss Miggs expressed her concurrence as before.
A runaway, my dear, but not a vagabond, returned the locksmith in a gentle tone. He behaved himself well, did Joe, always, and was a handsome, manly fellow. Don't call him a vagabond, Martha.
Mrs Varden coughed, and so did Miggs.
He tried hard to gain your good opinion, Martha, I can tell you,
said the locksmith, smiling and stroking his chin.
Ah, that he did. It seems but yesterday that he followed me out to the Maypole door one night, and begged me not to say how like a boy they used him. Say here at home, he meant, though at the time I recollect I didn't understand. And how's Miss Dolly, sir? Says Joe,
pursued the locksmith, musing sorrowfully.
Ah, poor Joe.
"Well, I declare!" cried Miggs. "Oh, goodness gracious me!"
What's the matter now? Said Gabriel, turning sharply to her.
"Why, if here aren't Miss Dolly," said the handmaid, stooping down to look into her face, "a giving way to floods of tears. Oh, mim, oh, sir, Raleigh, it's give me such a turn!"
cried the susceptible damsel, pressing her hand upon her side to quell the palpitation of her heart,
"that you might knock me down with a feather."
The locksmith, after glancing at Miss Miggs, as if he could have wished to have a feather brought straightway, looked on with a broad stare while Dolly hurried away, followed by that sympathizing young woman, then turning to his wife, stammered out,
"Is Dolly ill? Have I done anything? Is it my fault?"
"Your fault!" cried Mrs V. reproachfully. "There, you had better make haste out."
"What have I done?" said poor Gabriel. "It was agreed that Mr. Edward's name was never to be mentioned, and I have not spoken of him, have I?"
Mrs Varden merely replied that she had no patience with him, and bounced off after the other two. The unfortunate locksmith wound his sash about him, girded on his sword, put on his cap, and walked out.
"I am not much of a dab at my exercise," he said under his breath, "but I shall get into fewer scrapes at that work than at this. Every man came into the world for something. My department seems to be to make every woman cry without meaning it. It's rather hard."
But he forgot it before he reached the end of the street, and went on with a shining face, nodding to the neighbours, and showering about his friendly greetings like mild spring rain. End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 42. The Royal East London Volunteers made a brilliant sight that day, formed into lines, squares, circles, triangles, and what not, to the beating of drums and the streaming of flags, and performed a vast number of complex evolutions, in all of which Sergeant Varden bore a conspicuous share. Having displayed their military prowess to the utmost in these warlike shows, they marched in glittering order to the Chelsea Bun House, and regaled in the adjacent taverns until dark. Then at sound of drum they fell in again, and returned amidst the shouting of His Majesty's lieges to the place from whence they came. The homeward march being somewhat tardy, owing to the unsoldier-like behaviour of certain corporals, who, being gentlemen of sedentary pursuits in private life and excitable out of doors, broke several windows with their bayonets, and rendered it imperative on the commanding officer to deliver them over to a strong guard, with whom they fought at intervals as they came along. It was 9 o'clock when the locksmith reached home. A hackney coach was waiting near his door, and as he passed it, Mr Haredale looked from the window, and called him by his name.
"The sight of you is good for sore eyes, sir," said the locksmith, stepping up to him. "I wish you had walked in, though, rather than waited here."
"There is nobody at home, I find," Mr Haredale answered. "Besides, I desired to be as private as I could." "Humph!" muttered the locksmith, looking round at his house.
"Gone with Simon Tappertit to that precious branch, no doubt?"
Mr Haredale invited him to come into the coach, and, if he were not tired or anxious to go home, to ride with him a little way, that they might have some talk together. Gabriel cheerfully complied, and the coachman, mounting his box, drove off.
"Varden,"
said Mr Haredale, after a minute's pause, "you will be amazed to hear what errand I am on. It will seem a very strange one."
"I have no doubt it's a reasonable one, sir, and has a meaning in it," replied the locksmith, "or it would not be yours at all. Have you just come back to town, sir?"
"But half an hour ago."
"Bringing no news of Barnaby or his mother?" said the locksmith dubiously. "Ah, you needn't shake your head, sir. It was a wild goose chase. I feared that from the first. You exhausted all reasonable means of discovery when they went away. To begin again after so long a time has passed is hopeless, sir, quite hopeless."
"Why, where are they?" he returned impatiently. "Where can they be? Above ground?"
"God knows," rejoined the locksmith. "Many that I knew above it 5 years ago have their beds under the grass now, and the world is a wide place. It's a hopeless attempt, sir, believe me. We must leave the discovery of this mystery, like all others, to time and accident and heaven's pleasure."
"Varden, my good fellow," said Mr Haredale, "I have a deeper meaning in my present anxiety to find them out than you can fathom. It is not a mere whim. It is not the casual revival of my old wishes and desires, but an earnest, solemn purpose. My thoughts and dreams all tend to it, and fix it in my mind. I have no rest by day or night. I have no peace or quiet. I am haunted." His voice was so altered from its usual tones, and his manner bespoke so much emotion, that Gabriel in his wonder could only sit and look towards him in the darkness, and fancy the expression of his face. "Do not ask me," continued Mr Haredale, "to explain myself. If I were to do so, you would think me the victim of some hideous fancy. It is enough that this is so, and that I cannot, no, I cannot, lie quietly in my bed without doing what will seem to you incomprehensible."
"Since when, sir," said the locksmith after a pause, "has this uneasy feeling been upon you?"
Mr Haredale hesitated for some moments, and then replied, "Since the night of the storm. In short, since the last 19th of March." As though he feared that Varden might express surprise or reason with him, he hastily went on. "You will think, I know, I labour under some delusion. Perhaps I do, but it is not a morbid one. It is a wholesome action of the mind, reasoning on actual occurrences. You know the furniture remains in Mrs Rudge's house, and that it has been shut up, by my orders, since she went away, save once a week or so, when an old neighbour visits to scare away the rats. I am on my way there now." "For what purpose?" asked the locksmith. "To pass the night there," he replied. "And not to-night alone, but many nights. This is a secret which I trust to you in case of any unexpected emergency. You will not come, unless in case of strong necessity to me. From dusk to broad day I shall be there. Emma, your daughter, and the rest, suppose me out of London, as I have been until within this hour. Do not undeceive them. This is the errand I am bound upon. I know I may confide it to you, and I rely upon your questioning me no more at this time." With that, as if to change the theme, he led the astounded locksmith back to the night of the Maypole highwayman, to the robbery of Edward Chester, to the reappearance of the man at Mrs Rudge's house, and to all the strange circumstances which afterwards occurred. He even asked him carelessly about the man's height, his face, his figure, whether he was like any one he had ever seen, like Hugh, for instance, or any man he had known at any time, and put many questions of that sort, which the locksmith, considering them as mere devices to engage his attention and prevent his expressing the astonishment he felt, answered pretty much at random. At length they arrived at the corner of the street in which the house stood, where Mr Haredale, alighting, dismissed the coach. "If you desire to see me safely lodged," he said, turning to the locksmith with a gloomy smile, "you can." Gabriel, to whom all former marvels had been nothing in comparison with this, followed him along the narrow pavement in silence. When they reached the door, Mr Haredale softly opened it with a key he had about him, and closing it when Varden entered, they were left in thorough darkness. They groped their way into the ground-floor room. Here Mr Haredale struck a light, and kindled a pocket taper he had brought with him for the purpose. It was then, when the flame was full upon him, that the locksmith saw for the first time how haggard, pale, and changed he looked, how worn and thin he was, how perfectly his whole appearance coincided with all that he had said so strangely as they rode along. It was not an unnatural impulse in Gabriel, after what he had heard, to note curiously the expression of his eyes. It was perfectly collected and rational, so much so, indeed, that he felt ashamed of his momentary suspicion, and drooped his own when Mr Haredale looked towards him, as if he feared they would betray his thoughts. "Will you walk through the house?" said Mr Haredale, with a glance towards the window, the crazy shutters of which were closed and fastened. "Speak low." There was a kind of awe about the place, which would have rendered it difficult to speak in any other manner. Gabriel whispered, "Yes," and followed him upstairs. Everything was just as they had seen it last. There was a sense of closeness from the exclusion of fresh air, and a gloom and heaviness around, as though long imprisonment had made the very silence sad. The homely hangings of the beds and windows had begun to droop. The dust lay thick upon their dwindling folds, and damps had made their way through ceiling, wall, and floor. The boards creaked beneath their tread, as if resenting the unaccustomed intrusion. Nimble spiders, paralysed by the taper's glare, checked the motion of their 100 legs upon the wall, or dropped like lifeless things upon the ground. The death watch ticked, and the scampering feet of rats and mice rattled behind the wainscot. As they looked about them on the decaying furniture, it was strange to find how vividly it presented those to whom it had belonged, and with whom it was once familiar. Grip seemed to perch again upon his high-backed chair, Barnaby to crouch in his old favourite corner by the fire, the mother to resume her usual seat and watch him as of old. Even when they could separate these objects from the phantoms of the mind which they invoked, the latter only glided out of sight, but lingered near them still, for then they seemed to lurk in closets and behind the doors, ready to start out and suddenly accost them in well-remembered tones. They went downstairs, and again into the room they had just now left. Mr Haredale unbuckled his sword and laid it on the table with a pair of pocket pistols, then told the locksmith he would light him to the door.
"But this is a dull place, sir," said Gabriel, lingering. "May no one share your watch?"
He shook his head, and so plainly evinced his wish to be alone that Gabriel could say no more. In another moment the locksmith was standing in the street, whence he could see that the light once more travelled upstairs, and soon returning to the room below, shone brightly through the chinks of the shutters. If ever man were sorely puzzled and perplexed, the locksmith was that night. Even when snugly seated by his own fireside, with Mrs Varden opposite in a nightcap and night-jacket, and Dolly beside him in a most distracting dishabille, curling her hair, and smiling as if she had never cried in all her life and never could, even then, with Toby at his elbow and his pipe in his mouth, and Miggs, but that perhaps was not much, falling asleep in the background, he could not quite discard his wonder and uneasiness. So in his dreams, still there was Mr Haredale, haggard and careworn, listening in the solitary house to every sound that stirred, with the taper shining through the chinks until the day should turn it pale and end his lonely watching. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 43. Next morning brought no satisfaction to the locksmith's thoughts, nor next day, nor the next, nor many others. Often after nightfall he entered the street, and turned his eyes towards the well-known house, and as surely as he did so, there was the solitary light still gleaming through the crevices of the window-shutter, while all within was motionless, noiseless, cheerless as a grave. Unwilling to hazard Mr Haredale's favour by disobeying his strict injunction, he never ventured to knock at the door or to make his presence known in any way. But whenever strong interest and curiosity attracted him to the spot, which was not seldom, the light was always there. If he could have known what passed within, the knowledge would have yielded him no clue to this mysterious vigil. At twilight Mr Haredale shut himself up, and at daybreak he came forth. He never missed a night, always came and went alone, and never varied his proceedings in the least degree. The manner of his watch was this. At dusk he entered the house in the same way as when the locksmith bore him company, kindled a light, went through the rooms, and narrowly examined them. That done, he returned to the chamber on the ground floor, and laying his sword and pistols on the table, sat by it until morning. He usually had a book with him, and often tried to read, but never fixed his eyes or thoughts upon it for 5 minutes together. The slightest noise without doors caught his ear. A step upon the pavement seemed to make his heart leap. He was not without some refreshment during the long lonely hours, generally carrying in his pocket a sandwich of bread and meat, and a small flask of wine. The latter, diluted with large quantities of water, he drank in a heated, feverish way, as though his throat were dried, but he scarcely ever broke his fast by so much as a crumb of bread. If this voluntary sacrifice of sleep and comfort had its origin, as the locksmith on consideration was disposed to think, in any superstitious expectation of the fulfilment of a dream or vision connected with the event on which he had brooded for so many years, and if he waited for some ghostly visitor who walked abroad when men lay sleeping in their beds, he showed no trace of fear or wavering. His stern features expressed inflexible resolution. His brows were puckered, and his lips compressed with deep and settled purpose, and when he started at a noise and listened, it was not with the start of fear, but hope, and catching up his sword as though the hour had come at last, he would clutch it in his tight-clenched hand, and listen with sparkling eyes and eager looks, until it died away. These disappointments were numerous, for they ensued on almost every sound, but his constancy was not shaken. Still, every night he was at his post, the same stern, sleepless sentinel, and still night passed, and morning dawned, and he must watch again. This went on for weeks. He had taken a lodging at Vauxhall, in which to pass the day and rest himself, and from this place, when the tide served, he usually came to London Bridge from Westminster by water, in order that he might avoid the busy streets. One evening, shortly before twilight, he came his accustomed road upon the river's bank, intending to pass through Westminster Hall into Palace Yard, and there take boat to London Bridge as usual. There was a pretty large concourse of people assembled round the Houses of Parliament, looking at the members as they entered and departed, and giving vent to rather noisy demonstrations of approval or dislike, according to their known opinions. As he made his way among the throng, he heard once or twice the no-popery cry, which was then becoming pretty familiar to the ears of most men, but holding it in very slight regard, and observing that the idlers were of the lowest grade, he neither thought nor cared about it, but made his way along with perfect indifference. There were many little knots and groups of persons in Westminster Hall, some few looking upward at its noble ceiling and at the rays of evening light, tinted by the setting sun which streamed in aslant through its small windows, and growing dimmer by degrees, were quenched in the gathering gloom below. Some noisy passengers, mechanics going home from work and otherwise, who hurried quickly through, waking the echoes with their voices, and soon darkening the small door in the distance as they passed into the streets beyond. Some in busy conference together on political or private matters, pacing slowly up and down with eyes that sought the ground, and seeming by their attitudes to listen earnestly from head to foot. Here a dozen squabbling urchins made a very Babel in the air. There a solitary man, half clerk, half mendicant, paced up and down with hungry dejection in his look and gait. At his elbow passed an errand lad, swinging his basket round and round, and with his shrill whistle riving the very timbers of the roof, while a more observant schoolboy, half-way through, pocketed his ball and eyed the distant beadle as he came looming on. It was that time of evening when, if you shut your eyes and open them again, the darkness of an hour appears to have gathered in a second. The smooth-worn pavement, dusty with footsteps, still called upon the lofty walls to reiterate the shuffle and the tread of feet unceasingly, save when the closing of some heavy door resounded through the building like a clap of thunder, and drowned all other noises in its rolling sound. Mr Haredale, glancing only at such of these groups as he passed nearest to, and then in a manner betokening that his thoughts were elsewhere, had nearly traversed the hall when two persons before him caught his attention. One of these, a gentleman in elegant attire, carried in his hand a cane, which he twirled in a jaunty manner as he loitered on. The other, an obsequious, crouching, fawning figure, listened to what he said, at times throwing in a humble word himself, and, with his shoulders shrugged up to his ears, rubbed his hands submissively, or answered at intervals by an inclination of the head, half-way between a nod of acquiescence and a bow of most profound respect. In the abstract there was nothing very remarkable in this pair, for civility waiting on a handsome suit of clothes and a cane, not to speak of gold and silver sticks or wands of office, is common enough. But there was that about the well-dressed man, yes, and about the other likewise, which struck Mr Haredale with no pleasant feeling. He hesitated, stopped, and would have stepped aside and turned out of his path, but at the moment the other two faced about quickly and stumbled upon him before he could avoid them. The gentleman with the cane lifted his hat, and had begun to tender an apology, which Mr Haredale had begun as hastily to acknowledge and walk away, when he stopped short and cried,
Haredale! Gad bless me, this is strange indeed. It is, he returned impatiently. Yes, my dear friend, cried the other, detaining him, why such great speed? 1 minute, Haredale, for the sake of old acquaintance. I am in haste, he said. Neither of us has sought this meeting. Let it be a brief one. Good night. Fie, fie, replied Sir John, for it was he. How very churlish. We were speaking of you. Your name was on my lips. Perhaps you heard me mention it. No? I'm sorry for that. I'm really sorry. You know our friend here, Haredale. This is really a most remarkable meeting. The friend, plainly very ill at ease, had made bold to press Sir John's arm, and to give him other significant hints that he was desirous of avoiding this introduction. As it did not suit Sir John's purpose, however, that it should be evaded, he appeared quite unconscious of these silent remonstrances, and inclined his hand towards him as he spoke to call attention to him more particularly. The friend, therefore, had nothing for it but to muster up the pleasantest smile he could, and to make a conciliatory bow, as Mr Haredale turned his eyes upon him. Seeing that he was recognized, he put out his hand in an awkward and embarrassed manner, which was not mended by its contemptuous rejection. Mr Gashford, said Haredale coldly, it is as I have heard, then. You have left the darkness for the light, sir, and hate those whose opinions you formerly held with all the bitterness of a renegade. You are an honour, sir, to any cause. I wish the one you espouse at present much joy of the acquisition it has made. The secretary rubbed his hands and bowed, as though he would disarm his adversary by humbling himself before him. Sir John Chester again exclaimed with an air of great gaiety, "Now, really, this is a most remarkable meeting," and took a pinch of snuff with his usual self-possession. "Mr Haredale," said Gashford, stealthily raising his eyes, and letting them drop again when they met the other's steady gaze, "is too conscientious, too honourable, too manly, I am sure, to attach unworthy motives to an honest change of opinions, even though it implies a doubt of those he holds himself. Mr Haredale is too just, too generous, too clear-sighted in his moral vision to—" "Yes, sir," he rejoined with a sarcastic smile, finding the secretary stopped. "You were saying—" Gashford meekly shrugged his shoulders, and looking on the ground again, was silent. "No, but let us really," interposed Sir John at this juncture, "let us really, for a moment, contemplate the very remarkable character of this meeting. Haredale, my dear friend, pardon me if I think you are not sufficiently impressed with its singularity. Here we stand, by no previous appointment or arrangement, 3 old schoolfellows in Westminster Hall, 3 old boarders in a remarkably dull and shady seminary at St. Omer's, where you, being Catholics and of necessity educated out of England, were brought up, and where I, being a promising young Protestant at that time, was sent to learn the French tongue from a native of Paris. Add to the singularity, Sir John, said Mr Haredale, that some of you Protestants of promise are at this moment leagued in yonder building to prevent our having the surpassing and unheard-of privilege of teaching our children to read and write, here, in this land, where thousands of us enter your service every year, and to preserve the freedom of which we die in bloody battles abroad in heaps, and that others of you, to the numbers of some thousands as I learn, are led on to look on all men of my creed as wolves and beasts of prey, by this man Gashford. Add to it besides the bare fact that this man lives in society, walks the streets in broad day. I was about to say holds up his head, but that he does not, and it will be strange, and very strange, I grant you. Oh, you are hard upon our friend, replied Sir John with an engaging smile. You are really very hard upon our friend.
Let him go on, Sir John, said Gashford, fumbling with his gloves. Let him go on. I can make allowances, Sir John. I am honoured with your good opinion, and I can dispense with Mr. Haredale's. Mr. Haredale is a sufferer from the penal laws, and I can't expect his favour.
You have so much of my favour, sir, retorted Mr. Haredale, with a bitter glance at the third party in their conversation, that I am glad to see you in such good company. You are the essence of your great association in yourselves.
Now, there you mistake,
said Sir John, in his most benignant way. There, which is a most remarkable circumstance for a man of your punctuality and exactness, Haredale, you fall into error. I don't belong to the body. I have an immense respect for its members, but I don't belong to it, although I am, it is certainly true, the conscientious opponent of your being relieved. I feel it my duty to be so. It is a most unfortunate necessity, and cost me a bitter struggle. Will you try this box? If you don't object to a trifling infusion of a very chaste scent, you'll find its flavour exquisite. I ask your pardon, Sir John, said Mr. Haredale, declining the proffer with a motion of his hand, for having ranked you among the humble instruments who are obvious and in all men's sight. I should have done more justice to your genius. Men of your capacity plot in secrecy and safety, and leave exposed posts to the duller wits. Don't apologize for the world, replied Sir John sweetly. Old friends like you and I may be allowed some freedoms, or the deuce is in it. Gashford, who had been very restless all this time, but had not once looked up, now turned to Sir John and ventured to mutter something to the effect that he must go, or my lord would perhaps be waiting. Don't distress yourself, good sir, said Mr. Haredale. I'll take my leave, and put you at your ease. Which he was about to do without ceremony, when he was stayed by a buzz and murmur at the upper end of the hall, and, looking in that direction, saw Lord George Gordon coming in, with a crowd of people round him. There was a lurking look of triumph, though very differently expressed, in the faces of his two companions, which made it a natural impulse on Mr. Haredale's part not to give way before this leader, but to stand there while he passed. He drew himself up, and, clasping his hands behind him, looked on with a proud and scornful aspect, while Lord George slowly advanced, for the press was great about him, towards the spot where they were standing. He had left the House of Commons but that moment, and had come straight down into the hall, bringing with him, as his custom was, intelligence of what had been said that night in reference to the Papists, and what petitions had been presented in their favour, and who had supported them, and when the bill was to be brought in, and when it would be advisable to present their own great Protestant petition. All this he told the persons about him in a loud voice, and with great abundance of ungainly gesture. Those who were nearest him made comments to each other, and vented threats and murmurings. Those who were outside the crowd cried, "Silence!" and "Stand back!" or closed in upon the rest, endeavouring to make a forcible exchange of places, and so they came driving on in a very disorderly and irregular way, as it is the manner of a crowd to do. When they were very near to where the secretary, Sir John, and Mr. Haredale stood, Lord George turned round, and, making a few remarks of a sufficiently violent and incoherent kind, concluded with the usual sentiment, and called for 3 cheers to back it. While these were in the act of being given with great energy, he extricated himself from the press, and stepped up to Gashford's side. Both he and Sir John being well known to the populace, they fell back a little,
and left the four standing together. "Mr Haredale, Lord George," said Sir John Chester, seeing that the nobleman regarded him with an inquisitive look. "A Catholic gentleman, unfortunately, most unhappily a Catholic, but an esteemed acquaintance of mine, and once of Mr Gashford's. My dear Haredale, this is Lord George Gordon." "I should have known that, had I been ignorant of his lordship's person," said Mr Haredale. "I hope there is but one gentleman in England who, addressing an ignorant and excited throng, would speak of a large body of his fellow subjects in such injurious language as I heard this moment. For shame, my lord, for shame!" "I cannot talk to you, sir," replied Lord George in a loud voice, and waving his hand in a disturbed and agitated manner. "We have nothing in common." "We have much in common, many things, all that the Almighty gave us," said Mr Haredale, "and common charity, not to say common sense and common decency, should teach you to refrain from these proceedings. If every one of those men had arms in their hands at this moment, as they have them in their heads, I would not leave this place without telling you that you disgrace your station." "I don't hear you, sir," he replied in the same manner as before. "I can't hear you. It is indifferent to me what you say. Don't retort, Gashford." For the secretary had made a show of wishing to do so. "I can hold no communion with the worshippers of idols." As he said this, he glanced at Sir John, who lifted his hands and eyebrows as if deploring the intemperate conduct of Mr Haredale, and smiled in admiration of the crowd and of their leader. "He retort!" cried Haredale. "Look you here, my lord. Do you know this man?" Lord George replied by laying his hand upon the shoulder of his cringing secretary, and viewing him with a smile of confidence. "This man," said Mr Haredale, eyeing him from top to toe, "who in his boyhood was a thief, and has been from that time to this a servile, false, and truckling knave, this man who has crawled and crept through life, wounding the hands he licked, and biting those he fawned upon, this sycophant, who never knew what honour, truth, or courage meant, who robbed his benefactor's daughter of her virtue, and married her to break her heart, and did it with stripes and cruelty, this creature who has whined at kitchen windows for the broken food, and begged for halfpence at our chapel doors, this apostle of the faith whose tender conscience cannot bear the altars where his vicious life was publicly denounced. Do you know this man?" "Oh, really, you are very, very hard upon our friend," exclaimed Sir John.
"Let Mr Haredale go on,"
said Gashford, upon whose unwholesome face the perspiration had broken out during this speech in blotches of wet.
"I don't mind him, Sir John. It's quite as indifferent to me what he says as it is to my lord. If he reviles my lord, as you have heard, Sir John, how can I hope to escape?"
"Is it not enough, my lord," Mr Haredale continued, "that I, as good a gentleman as you, must hold my property, such as it is, by a trick at which the state connives because of these hard laws, and that we may not teach our youth in schools the common principles of right and wrong, but must we be denounced and ridden by such men as this? Here is a man to head your no-popery cry. For shame! For shame!" The infatuated nobleman had glanced more than once at Sir John Chester, as if to inquire whether there was any truth in these statements concerning Gashford, and Sir John had as often plainly answered by a shrug or look, "Oh dear me, no." He now said, in the same loud key, and in the same strange manner as before, "I have nothing to say, sir, in reply, and no desire to hear anything more. I beg you won't obtrude your conversation, or these personal attacks upon me. I shall not be deterred from doing my duty to my country and my countrymen by any such attempts, whether they proceed from the emissaries of the Pope or not, I assure you. Come, Gashford." They had walked on a few paces while speaking, and were now at the hall door, through which they passed together. Mr Haredale, without any leave-taking, turned away to the river stairs, which were close at hand, and hailed the only boatman who remained there. But the throng of people, the foremost of whom had heard every word that Lord George Gordon said, and among all of whom the rumour had been rapidly dispersed that the stranger was a papist who was bearding him for his advocacy of the popular cause, came pouring out pell-mell, and, forcing the nobleman, his secretary, and Sir John Chester on before them, so that they appeared to be at their head, crowded to the top of the stairs where Mr Haredale waited until the boat was ready, and there stood still, leaving him on a little clear space by himself. They were not silent, however, though inactive. At first some indistinct mutterings arose among them, which were followed by a hiss or two, and these swelled by degrees into a perfect storm. Then one voice said, "Down with the papists!" and there was a pretty general cheer, but nothing more. After a lull of a few moments, one man cried out, "Stone him!" Another, "Duck him!" Another, in a stentorian voice, "No-popery!" This favourite cry the rest re-echoed, and the mob, which might have been 200 strong, joined in a general shout. Mr Haredale had stood calmly on the brink of the steps until they made this demonstration, when he looked round contemptuously and walked at a slow pace down the stairs. He was pretty near the boat, when Gashford, as if without intention, turned about, and directly afterwards a great stone was thrown by some hand in the crowd, which struck him on the head and made him stagger like a drunken man. The blood sprung freely from the wound and trickled down his coat. He turned directly, and rushing up the steps with a boldness and passion which made them all fall back, demanded, "Who did that? Show me the man who hit me." Not a soul moved, except some in the rear who slunk off, and, escaping to the other side of the way, looked on like indifferent spectators. "Who did that?" he repeated. "Show me the man who did it. Dog, was it you? It was your deed, if not your hand. I know you." He threw himself on Gashford as he said the words, and hurled him to the ground. There was a sudden motion in the crowd, and some laid hands upon him, but his sword was out, and they fell off again. "My lord! Sir John!" he cried. "Draw, one of you! You are responsible for this outrage, and I look to you. Draw, if you are gentlemen." With that he struck Sir John upon the breast with the flat of his weapon, and with a burning face and flashing eyes stood upon his guard, alone, before them all. For an instant, for the briefest space of time the mind can readily conceive, there was a change in Sir John's smooth face, such as no man ever saw there. The next moment he stepped forward and laid one hand on Mr Haredale's arm, while with the other he endeavoured to appease the crowd. "My dear friend, my good Haredale, you are blinded with passion. It's very natural, extremely natural, but you don't know friends from foes." "I know them all, sir. I can distinguish well," he retorted, almost mad with rage. "Sir John, Lord George, do you hear me? Are you cowards?" "Never mind, sir," said a man, forcing his way between and pushing him towards the stairs with friendly violence. "Never mind asking that. For God's sake, get away. What can you do against this number? And there are as many more in the next street, who'll be round directly." Indeed, they began to pour in as he said the words. "You be giddy from that cut, in the first heat of a scuffle. Now do retire, sir, or take my word for it, you'll be worse used than you would be if every man in the crowd was a woman, and that woman Bloody Mary. Come, sir, make haste, as quick as you can." Mr Haredale, who began to turn faint and sick, felt how sensible this advice was, and descended the steps with his unknown friend's assistance. John Grueby, for John it was, helped him into the boat, and giving her a shove off, which sent her 30 feet into the tide, bade the waterman pull away like a Briton, and walked up again as composedly as if he had just landed. There was at first a slight disposition on the part of the mob to resent this interference, but John, looking particularly strong and cool, and wearing besides Lord George's livery, they thought better of it, and contented themselves with sending a shower of small missiles after the boat, which plashed harmlessly in the water, for she had by this time cleared the bridge, and was darting swiftly down the centre of the stream. From this amusement they proceeded to giving Protestant knocks at the doors of private houses, breaking a few lamps, and assaulting some stray constables. But, it being whispered that a detachment of life guards had been sent for, they took to their heels with great expedition, and left the street quite clear. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 44. When the concourse separated, and, dividing into chance clusters, drew off in various directions, there still remained upon the scene of the late disturbance one man. This man was Gashford, who, bruised by his late fall, and hurt in a much greater degree by the indignity he had undergone, and the exposure of which he had been the victim, limped up and down, breathing curses and threats of vengeance. It was not the secretary's nature to waste his wrath in words. While he vented the froth of his malevolence in those effusions, he kept a steady eye on two men, who, having disappeared with the rest when the alarm was spread, had since returned, and were now visible in the moonlight at no great distance, as they walked to and fro and talked together. He made no move towards them, but waited patiently on the dark side of the street, until they were tired of strolling backwards and forwards, and walked away in company. Then he followed, but at some distance, keeping them in view, without appearing to have that object, or being seen by them. They went up Parliament Street, past St. Martin's Church, and away by St. Giles's to Tottenham Court Road, at the back of which, upon the western side, was then a place called the Green Lanes. This was a retired spot, not of the choicest kind, leading into the fields. Great heaps of ashes, stagnant pools, overgrown with rank grass and duckweed, broken turnstiles, and the upright posts of palings long since carried off for firewood, which menaced all heedless walkers with their jagged and rusty nails, were the leading features of the landscape, while here and there a donkey or a ragged horse, tethered to a stake and cropping off a wretched meal from the coarse stunted turf, were quite in keeping with the scene, and would have suggested, if the houses had not done so sufficiently of themselves, how very poor the people were who lived in the crazy huts adjacent, and how foolhardy it might prove for one who carried money, or wore decent clothes, to walk that way alone, unless by daylight. Poverty has its whims and shows of taste, as wealth has. Some of these cabins were turreted, some had false windows painted on their rotten walls. One had a mimic clock, upon a crazy tower of 4 feet high, which screened the chimney. Each in its little patch of ground had a rude seat or arbour. The population dealt in bones, in rags, in broken glass, in old wheels, in birds and dogs. These, in their several ways of stowage, filled the gardens, and shedding a perfume not of the most delicious nature in the air, filled it besides with yelps and screams and howling. Into this retreat the secretary followed the two men whom he had held in sight, and here he saw them safely lodged in one of the meanest houses, which was but a room, and that of small dimensions. He waited without until the sound of their voices, joined in a discordant song, assured him they were making merry, and then approaching the door by means of a tottering plank which crossed the ditch in front, knocked at it with his hand. "Muster Gashford," said the man who opened it, taking his pipe from his mouth in evident surprise. "Why,
Who'd have thought of this here honour? Walk in, Muster Gashford. Walk in, sir.
Gashford required no second invitation, and entered with a gracious air. There was a fire in the rusty grate, for though the spring was pretty far advanced, the nights were cold, and on a stool beside it Hugh sat smoking. Dennis placed a chair, his only one, for the secretary, in front of the hearth, and took his seat again upon the stool he had left when he rose to give the visitor admission.
"What's in the wind now, Muster Gashford?"
he said, as he resumed his pipe and looked at him askew.
"Any orders from headquarters? Are we going to begin? What is it, Muster Gashford?"
"Oh, nothing, nothing," rejoined the secretary with a friendly nod to Hugh. "We have broken the ice, though. We had a little spurt to-day, Dennis?"
"A very little one,"
growled the hangman.
"Not half enough for me."
"Nor me neither," cried Hugh. "Give us something to do with life in it, master." "Why, you wouldn't," said the secretary, with his worst expression of face, and in his mildest tones, "have anything to do with death in it?"
"I don't know that," replied Hugh. "I'm open to orders. I don't care, not I." "Nor I," vociferated Dennis.
"Brave fellows,"
said the secretary, in as pastor-like a voice as if he were commending them for some uncommon act of valour and generosity.
"By the by,"
and here he stopped and warmed his hands, then suddenly looked up.
"Who threw that stone to-day?"
Mr Dennis coughed and shook his head, as who should say, a mystery indeed. Hugh sat and smoked in silence.
"It was well done,"
said the secretary, warming his hands again.
"I should like to know that man."
"Would you?"
said Dennis, after looking into his face to assure himself that he was serious.
"Would you like to know that man, Muster Gashford?"
"I should indeed," replied the secretary.
"Why then, Lord love you,"
said the hangman in his hoarsest chuckle, as he pointed with his pipe to Hugh.
"There he sits. That's the man. My stars and halters, Muster Gashford,"
he added in a whisper as he drew his stool close to him and jogged him with his elbow.
"What a interesting blade he is! He wants as much holding in as a thoroughbred bulldog. If it hadn't been for me to-day, he'd have had that here Roman down, and made a riot of it in another minute."
"And why not?"
cried Hugh in a surly voice, as he overheard this last remark.
"Where's the good of putting things off? Strike while the iron's hot, that's what I say."
"Ah!" retorted Dennis, shaking his head with a kind of pity for his friend's ingenuous youth.
"But suppose the iron an't hot, brother? You must get people's blood up afore you strike, and have 'em in the humour. There wasn't quite enough to provoke 'em to-day, I tell you. If you'd had your way, you'd have spoilt the fun to come, and ruined us."
"Dennis is quite right," said Gashford smoothly. "He is perfectly correct. Dennis has great knowledge of the world."
"I ought to have, Muster Gashford, seeing what a many people I've helped out of it, eh?"
grinned the hangman, whispering the words behind his hand. The secretary laughed at this jest as much as Dennis could desire, and when he had done, said, turning to Hugh,
"Dennis's policy was mine, as you may have observed. You saw, for instance, how I fell when I was set upon. I made no resistance. I did nothing to provoke an outbreak. Oh, dear no."
"No, by the Lord Harry,"
cried Dennis with a noisy laugh,
You went down very quiet, Muster Gashford, and very flat besides. I thinks to myself at the time, it's all up with Muster Gashford. I never see a man lay flatter nor more still with the life in him than you did today. He's a rough 'un to play with, is that here papist, and that's the fact.'
The secretary's face, as Dennis roared with laughter and turned his wrinkled eyes on Hugh, who did the like, might have furnished a study for the devil's picture. He sat quite silent until they were serious again, and then said, looking round,
'We are very pleasant here, so very pleasant, Dennis, that but for my lord's particular desire that I should sup with him, and the time being very near at hand, I should be inclined to stay until it would be hardly safe to go homeward. I come upon a little business, yes I do, as you supposed. It's very flattering to you, being this. If we ever should be obliged, and we can't tell, you know, this is a very uncertain world.'
'I believe you, Muster Gashford,'
interposed the hangman with a grave nod.
'The uncertainties as I've seen in reference to this here state of existence, the unexpected contingencies as have come about, oh my eye!'
Feeling the subject much too vast for expression, he puffed at his pipe again, and looked the rest.
'I say,'
resumed the secretary in a slow, impressive way,
'we can't tell what may come to pass, and if we should be obliged, against our wills, to have recourse to violence, my lord, who has suffered terribly to-day as far as words can go, consigns to you two, bearing in mind my recommendation of you both, as good staunch men, beyond all doubt and suspicion, the pleasant task of punishing this Haredale. You may do as you please with him, or his, provided that you show no mercy and no quarter, and leave no two beams of his house standing where the builder placed them. You may sack it, burn it, do with it as you like, but it must come down. It must be razed to the ground, and he and all belonging to him left as shelterless as new-born infants whom their mothers have exposed. Do you understand me?'
said Gashford, pausing and pressing his hands together gently.
'Understand you, master!' cried Hugh. 'You speak plain now. Why, this is hearty.'
'I knew you would like it,'
said Gashford, shaking him by the hand.
'I thought you would. Good night. Don't rise, Dennis. I would rather find my way alone. I may have to make other visits here, and it's pleasant to come and go without disturbing you. I can find my way perfectly well. Good night.'
He was gone, and had shut the door behind him. They looked at each other and nodded approvingly. Dennis stirred up the fire.
'This looks a little more like business,' he said.
'Ay, indeed!'
cried Hugh. 'This suits me.' 'I've heard it said of Muster Gashford,' said the hangman, 'that he'd a surprising memory and wonderful firmness, that he never forgot and never forgave. Let's drink his health.'
Hugh readily complied, pouring no liquor on the floor when he drank this toast, and they pledged the secretary as a man after their own hearts in a bumper. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 45. While the worst passions of the worst men were thus working in the dark, and the mantle of religion, assumed to cover the ugliest deformities, threatened to become the shroud of all that was good and peaceful in society, a circumstance occurred which once more altered the position of two persons from whom this history has long been separated, and to whom it must now return. In a small English country town, the inhabitants of which supported themselves by the labour of their hands in plaiting and preparing straw for those who made bonnets and other articles of dress and ornament from that material. Concealed under an assumed name, and living in a quiet poverty which knew no change, no pleasures, and few cares but that of struggling on from day to day in one great toil for bread, dwelt Barnaby and his mother. Their poor cottage had known no stranger's foot since they sought the shelter of its roof 5 years before, nor had they in all that time held any commerce or communication with the old world from which they had fled. To labour in peace, and devote her labour and her life to her poor son, was all the widow sought. If happiness can be said at any time to be the lot of one on whom a secret sorrow preys, she was happy now. Tranquillity, resignation, and her strong love of him who needed it so much, formed the small circle of her quiet joys, and while that remained unbroken, she was contented. For Barnaby himself, the time which had flown by had passed him like the wind. The daily suns of years had shed no brighter gleam of reason on his mind. No dawn had broken on his long dark night. He would sit sometimes, often for days together, on a low seat by the fire or by the cottage door, busy at work, for he had learnt the art his mother plied, and listening, God help him, to the tales she would repeat, as a lure to keep him in her sight. He had no recollection of these little narratives. The tale of yesterday was new to him upon the morrow. But he liked them at the moment, and when the humour held him, would remain patiently within doors, hearing her stories like a little child, and working cheerfully from sunrise until it was too dark to see. At other times, and then their scanty earnings were barely sufficient to furnish them with food, though of the coarsest sort, he would wander abroad from dawn of day until the twilight deepened into night. Few in that place, even of the children, could be idle, and he had no companions of his own kind. Indeed, there were not many who could have kept up with him in his rambles, had there been a legion. But there were a score of vagabond dogs belonging to the neighbours, who served his purpose quite as well. With 2 or 3 of these, or sometimes with a full half-dozen barking at his heels, he would sally forth on some long expedition that consumed the day, and though on their return at nightfall the dogs would come home limping and sore-footed and almost spent with their fatigue, Barnaby was up and off again at sunrise with some new attendants of the same class, with whom he would return in like manner. On all these travels, Grip, in his little basket at his master's back, was a constant member of the party, and when they set off in fine weather and in high spirits, no dog barked louder than the raven. Their pleasures on these excursions were simple enough. A crust of bread and scrap of meat, with water from the brook or spring, sufficed for their repast. Barnaby's enjoyments were to walk and run and leap till he was tired, then to lie down in the long grass, or by the growing corn, or in the shade of some tall tree, looking upward at the light clouds as they floated over the blue surface of the sky, and listening to the lark as she poured out her brilliant song. There were wild flowers to pluck, the bright red poppy, the gentle harebell, the cowslip, and the rose. There were birds to watch, fish, ants, worms, hares or rabbits, as they darted across the distant pathway in the wood, and so were gone. Millions of living things to have an interest in, and lie in wait for, and clap hands and shout in memory of, when they had disappeared. In default of these, or when they wearied, there was the merry sunlight to hunt out, as it crept in aslant through leaves and boughs of trees, and hid far down, deep, deep in hollow places, like a silver pool, where nodding branches seemed to bathe and sport, sweet scents of summer air breathing over fields of beans or clover, the perfume of wet leaves or moss, the life of waving trees and shadows always changing. When these or any of them tired, or in excess of pleasing tempted him to shut his eyes, there was slumber in the midst of all these soft delights, with the gentle wind murmuring like music in his ears, and everything around melting into one delicious dream. Their hut, for it was little more, stood on the outskirts of the town, at a short distance from the high road, but in a secluded place, where few chance passengers strayed at any season of the year. It had a plot of garden ground attached, which Barnaby, in fits and starts of working, trimmed and kept in order. Within doors and without, his mother laboured for their common good, and hail, rain, snow, or sunshine found no difference in her. Though so far removed from the scenes of her past life, and with so little thought or hope of ever visiting them again, she seemed to have a strange desire to know what happened in the busy world. Any old newspaper or scrap of intelligence from London she caught at with avidity. The excitement it produced was not of a pleasurable kind, for her manner at such times expressed the keenest anxiety and dread, but it never faded in the least degree. Then, and in stormy winter nights, when the wind blew loud and strong, the old expression came into her face, and she would be seized with a fit of trembling, like one who had an ague. But Barnaby noted little of this, and putting a great constraint upon herself, she usually recovered her accustomed manner before the change had caught his observation. Grip was by no means an idle or unprofitable member of the humble household. Partly by dint of Barnaby's tuition, and partly by pursuing a species of self-instruction common to his tribe, and exerting his powers of observation to the utmost, he had acquired a degree of sagacity which rendered him famous for miles round. His conversational powers and surprising performances were the universal theme, and as many persons came to see the wonderful raven, and none left his exertions unrewarded, when he condescended to exhibit, which was not always, for genius is capricious, his earnings formed an important item in the common stock. Indeed, the bird himself appeared to know his value well, for though he was perfectly free and unrestrained in the presence of Barnaby and his mother, he maintained in public an amazing gravity, and never stooped to any other gratuitous performances than biting the ankles of vagabond boys, an exercise in which he much delighted, killing a fowl or two occasionally, and swallowing the dinners of various neighbouring dogs, of whom the boldest held him in great awe and dread. Time had glided on in this way, and nothing had happened to disturb or change their mode of life, when, one summer's night in June, they were in their little garden, resting from the labours of the day. The widow's work was yet upon her knee, and strewn upon the ground about her, and Barnaby stood leaning on his spade, gazing at the brightness in the west, and singing softly to himself.
"A brave evening, mother. If we had chinking in our pockets but a few specks of that gold which is piled up yonder in the sky, we should be rich for life." "We are better as we are," returned the widow, with a quiet smile. "Let us be contented, and we do not want and need not care to have it, though it lay shining at our feet." "Ay," said Barnaby, resting with crossed arms on his spade, and looking wistfully at the sunset. "That's well enough, mother, but gold's a good thing to have. I wish that I knew where to find it. Grip and I could do much with gold, be sure of that." "What would you do?" she asked. "What? A world of things. We'd dress finely, you and I mean, not Grip. Keep horses, dogs, wear bright colours and feathers, do no more work, live delicately and at our ease. Oh, we'd find uses for it, mother, and uses that would do us good. I would I knew where gold was buried. How hard I'd work to dig it up." "You do not know," said his mother, rising from her seat and laying her hand upon his shoulder, "what men have done to win it, and how they have found, too late,
that it glitters brightest at a distance and turns quite dim and dull when handled. Ay, ay, so you say, so you think, he answered, still looking eagerly in the same direction. For all that, mother, I should like to try. Do you not see, she said, how red it is? Nothing bears so many stains of blood as gold. Avoid it. None have such cause to hate its name as we have. Do not so much as think of it, dear love. It has brought such misery and suffering on your head and mine as few have known, and God grant few may have to undergo. I would rather we were dead and laid down in our graves than you should ever come to love it. For a moment Barnaby withdrew his eyes and looked at her with wonder. Then, glancing from the redness in the sky to the mark upon his wrist, as if he would compare the two, he seemed about to question her with earnestness, when a new object caught his wandering attention and made him quite forgetful of his purpose. This was a man with dusty feet and garments, who stood, bareheaded, behind the hedge that divided their patch of garden from the pathway, and leant meekly forward as if he sought to mingle with their conversation, and waited for his time to speak. His face was turned towards the brightness too, but the light that fell upon it showed that he was blind, and saw it not. "A blessing on those voices," said the wayfarer. "I feel the beauty of the night more keenly when I hear them. They are like eyes to me. Will they speak again, and cheer the heart of a poor traveller?" "Have you no guide?" asked the widow, after a moment's pause. "None but that," he answered, pointing with his staff towards the sun, "and sometimes a milder one at night, but she is idle now." "Have you travelled far?" "A weary way and long," rejoined the traveller as he shook his head. "A weary, weary way. I struck my stick just now upon the bucket of your well. Be pleased to let me have a draught of water, lady." "Why do you call me lady?" she returned. "I am as poor as you." "Your speech is soft and gentle, and I judge by that," replied the man. "The coarsest stuffs and finest silks are, apart from a sense of touch, alike to me. I cannot judge you by your dress." "Come round this way," said Barnaby, who had passed out at the garden gate, and now stood close beside him. "Put your hand in mine. You're blind, and always in the dark, eh? Are you frightened in the dark? Do you see great crowds of faces now? Do they grin and chatter?" "Alas!" returned the other, "I see nothing. Waking or sleeping, nothing." Barnaby looked curiously at his eyes, and touching them with his fingers, as an inquisitive child might, led him towards the house. "You have come a long distance," said the widow, meeting him at the door. "How have you found your way so far?" "Use and necessity are good teachers, as I have heard, the best of any," said the blind man, sitting down upon the chair to which Barnaby had led him, and putting his hat and stick upon the red-tiled floor. "May neither you nor your son ever learn under them. They are rough masters." "You have wandered from the road, too," said the widow, in a tone of pity. "Maybe, maybe," returned the blind man with a sigh, and yet with something of a smile upon his face. "That's likely. Handposts and milestones are dumb indeed to me. Thank you the more for this rest and this refreshing drink." As he spoke, he raised the mug of water to his mouth. It was clear and cold and sparkling, but not to his taste nevertheless, or his thirst was not very great, for he only wetted his lips and put it down again. He wore, hanging with a long strap round his neck, a kind of scrip or wallet, in which to carry food.
The widow set some bread and cheese before him, but he thanked her, and said that through the kindness of the charitable he had broken his fast once since morning, and was not hungry. When he had made her this reply, he opened his wallet and took out a few pence, which was all it appeared to contain.
"Might I make bold to ask," he said, turning towards where Barnaby stood looking on, "that one who has the gift of sight would lay this out for me in bread to keep me on my way? Heaven's blessing on the young feet that will bestir themselves in aid of one so helpless as a sightless man."
Barnaby looked at his mother, who nodded assent. In another moment he was gone upon his charitable errand. The blind man sat listening with an attentive face, until long after the sound of his retreating footsteps was inaudible to the widow, and then said suddenly, and in a very altered tone,
"There are various degrees and kinds of blindness, widow. There is the connubial blindness, ma'am, which perhaps you may have observed in the course of your own experience, and which is a kind of wilful and self-bandaging blindness. There is the blindness of party, ma'am, and public men, which is the blindness of a mad bull in the midst of a regiment of soldiers clothed in red. There is the blind confidence of youth, which is the blindness of young kittens, whose eyes have not yet opened on the world. And there is that physical blindness, ma'am, of which I am, contrary to my own desire, a most illustrious example. Added to these, ma'am, is that blindness of the intellect, of which we have a specimen in your interesting son, and which, having sometimes glimmerings and dawnings of the light, is scarcely to be trusted as a total darkness. Therefore, ma'am, I have taken the liberty to get him out of the way for a short time, while you and I confer together, and this precaution arising out of the delicacy of my sentiment toward yourself. You will excuse me, ma'am, I know."
Having delivered himself of this speech with many flourishes of manner, he drew from beneath his coat a flat stone bottle, and holding the cork between his teeth, qualified his mug of water with a plentiful infusion of the liquor it contained. He politely drained the bumper to her health and the lady's, and setting it down empty, smacked his lips with infinite relish.
"I'm a citizen of the world, ma'am," said the blind man, corking his bottle, "and if I seem to conduct myself with freedom, it is therefore. You wonder who I am, ma'am, and what has brought me here. Such experience of human nature as I have leads me to that conclusion, without the aid of eyes by which to read the movements of your soul as depicted in your feminine features. I will satisfy your curiosity immediately, ma'am, immediately."
With that he slapped his bottle on its broad back, and having put it under his garment as before, crossed his legs and folded his hands, and settled himself in his chair, previous to proceeding any further. The change in his manner was so unexpected, the craft and wickedness of his deportment were so much aggravated by his condition, for we are accustomed to see in those who have lost a human sense something in its place almost divine, and this alteration bred so many fears in her whom he addressed, that she could not pronounce one word. After waiting, as it seemed, for some remark or answer, and waiting in vain, the visitor resumed.
"Madam, my name is Stagg. A friend of mine, who has desired the honour of meeting with you any time these 5 years past, has commissioned me to call upon you. I should be glad to whisper that gentleman's name in your ear." "Zounds, ma'am, are you deaf? Do you hear me say that I should be glad to whisper my friend's name in your ear?"
"You need not repeat it," said the widow, with a stifled groan. "I see too well from whom you come."
"But as a man of honour, ma'am,"
said the blind man, striking himself on the breast,
"whose credentials must not be disputed, I take leave to say that I will mention that gentleman's name. Ay, ay," he added, seeming to catch with his quick ear the very motion of her hand, "but not aloud. With your leave, ma'am, I desire the favour of a whisper."
She moved towards him, and stooped down. He muttered a word in her ear, and, wringing her hands, she paced up and down the room like one distracted. The blind man, with perfect composure, produced his bottle again, mixed another glassful, put it up as before, and, drinking from time to time, followed her with his face in silence.
You are slow in conversation, widow,' he said after a time, pausing in his draught. 'We shall have to talk before your son.'
'What would you have me do?' she answered. 'What do you want?'
'We are poor, widow, we are poor,' he retorted, stretching out his right hand and rubbing his thumb upon its palm.
'Poor!' she cried. 'And what am I?'
'Comparisons are odious,' said the blind man. 'I don't know. I don't care. I say that we are poor. My friend's circumstances are indifferent, and so are mine. We must have our rights, widow, or we must be bought off. But you know that as well as I, so where is the use of talking?'
She still walked wildly to and fro. At length, stopping abruptly before him, she said, 'Is he near here?'
'He is. Close at hand.'
'Then I am lost.'
'Not lost, widow,' said the blind man calmly. 'Only found. Shall I call him?'
'Not for the world,' she answered with a shudder.
'Very good,'
he replied, crossing his legs again, for he had made as though he would rise and walk to the door.
'As you please, widow. His presence is not necessary that I know of, but both he and I must live. To live, we must eat and drink. To eat and drink, we must have money. I say no more.'
'Do you know how pinched and destitute I am?' she retorted. 'I do not think you do, or can. If you had eyes and could look around you on this poor place, you would have pity on me. Oh, let your heart be softened by your own affliction, friend, and have some sympathy with mine.' The blind man snapped his fingers as he answered,
'Beside the question, ma'am, beside the question. I have the softest heart in the world, but I can't live upon it. Many a gentleman lives well upon a soft head, who would find a heart of the same quality a very great drawback. Listen to me. This is a matter of business, with which sympathies and sentiments have nothing to do. As a mutual friend, I wish to arrange it in a satisfactory manner if possible, and thus the case stands. If you are very poor now, it's your own choice. You have friends who, in case of need, are always ready to help you. My friend is in a more destitute and desolate situation than most men, and you and he being linked together in a common cause, he naturally looks to you to assist him. He has boarded and lodged with me a long time, for as I said just now, I am very soft-hearted, and I quite approve of his entertaining this opinion. You have always had a roof over your head. He has always been an outcast. You have your son to comfort and assist you. He has nobody at all. The advantages must not be all one side. You are in the same boat, and we must divide the ballast a little more equally.' She was about to speak, but he checked her, and went on. 'The only way of doing this is by making up a little purse now and then for my friend, and that's what I advise. He bears you no malice that I know of, ma'am, so little that although you have treated him harshly more than once, and driven him, I may say, out of doors, he has that regard for you that I believe, even if you disappointed him now, he would consent to take charge of your son, and to make a man of him.' He laid a great stress on these latter words, and paused as if to find out what effect they had produced. She only answered by her tears. 'He's a likely lad,' said the blind man thoughtfully, 'for many purposes, and not ill disposed to try his fortune in a little change and bustle, if I may judge from what I heard of his talk with you to-night. Come! In a word, my friend has pressing necessity for £20. You, who can give up an annuity, can get that sum for him. It's a pity you should be troubled. You seem very comfortable here, and it's worth that much to remain so. £20, widow, is a moderate demand. You know where to apply for it. A post will bring it to you. £20. She was about to answer him again, but again he stopped her. 'Don't say anything hastily. You might be sorry for it. Think of it a little while. £20 of other people's money. How easy. Turn it over in your mind. I'm in no hurry. Night's coming on, and if I don't sleep here, I shall not go far. £20. £8. Consider of it, ma'am, for 20 minutes. Give each £1 a minute. That's a fair allowance. I'll enjoy the air the while, which is very mild and pleasant in these parts.' With these words he groped his way to the door, carrying his chair with him. Then seating himself under a spreading honeysuckle, and stretching his legs across the threshold so that no person could pass in or out without his knowledge, he took from his pocket a pipe, flint, steel, and tinder box, and began to smoke. It was a lovely evening, of that gentle kind, and at the time of year when the twilight is most beautiful. Pausing now and then to let his smoke curl slowly off, and to sniff the grateful fragrance of the flowers, he sat there at his ease, as though the cottage were his proper dwelling, and he had held undisputed possession of it all his life, waiting for the widow's answer and for Barnaby's return. End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 46. When Barnaby returned with the bread, the sight of the pious old pilgrim smoking his pipe and making himself so thoroughly at home appeared to surprise even him. The more so, as that worthy person, instead of putting up the loaf in his wallet as a scarce and precious article, tossed it carelessly on the table, and producing his bottle, bade him sit down and drink. "For I carry some comfort, you see," he said. "Taste that. Is it good?" The water stood in Barnaby's eyes as he coughed from the strength of the draught, and answered in the affirmative. "Drink some more," said the blind man. "Don't be afraid of it. You don't taste anything like that often, eh?"
"Often!"
cried Barnaby.
"Never!"
"Too poor," returned the blind man with a sigh. "Aye, that's bad. Your mother, poor soul, would be happier if she was richer, Barnaby."
"Why, so I tell her. The very thing I told her just before you came to-night, when all that gold was in the sky," said Barnaby, drawing his chair nearer to him, and looking eagerly in his face. "Tell me, is there any way of being rich that I could find out?"
"Any way? 100 ways."
"Aye, aye,"
he returned.
"Do you say so? What are they? Nay, mother, it's for your sake I ask, not mine, for yours indeed. What are they?"
The blind man turned his face, on which there was a smile of triumph, to where the widow stood in great distress, and answered, "Why, they are not to be found out by stay-at-homes, my good friend."
"By stay-at-homes!"
cried Barnaby, plucking at his sleeve.
"But I am not one. Now there you mistake. I'm often out before the sun, and travel home when he's gone to rest. I am away in the woods before the day has reached the shady places, and am often there when the bright moon is peeping through the boughs and looking down upon the other moon that it lives in the water. As I walk along, I try to find among the grass and moss some of that small money for which you work so hard and used to shed so many tears. As I lie asleep in the shade, I dream of it, dream of digging it up in heaps and spying it out, hidden under bushes, and seeing it sparkle as the dewdrops do among the leaves. But I never find it. Tell me where it is. I'd go there if the journey were a whole year long, because I know she would be happier when I came home and brought some with me. Speak again. I'll listen to you if you talk all night."
The blind man passed his hand lightly over the poor fellow's face, and finding that his elbows were planted on the table, that his chin rested on his 2 hands, that he leaned eagerly forward, and that his whole manner expressed the utmost interest and anxiety,
paused for a minute, as though he desired the widow to observe this fully, and then made answer.
It's in the world, bold Barnaby, the merry world. Not in solitary places like those you pass your time in, but in crowds, and where there's noise and rattle.
Oh, good, good,
cried Barnaby, rubbing his hands.
Yes, I love that. Grip loves it too. It suits us both. That's brave.
The kind of places, said the blind man, that a young fellow likes, and in which a good son may do more for his mother and himself to boot in a month than he could here in all his life. That is, if he had a friend, you know, and someone to advise with.
You hear this, mother?
cried Barnaby, turning to her with delight.
Never tell me we shouldn't heed it, if it lay shining at our feet. Why do we heed it so much now? Why do you toil from morning until night?
Surely, said the blind man, surely. Have you no answer, widow? Is your mind, he slowly added, not made up yet?
Let me speak with you, she answered, apart.
Lay your hand upon my sleeve,
said Stagg, arising from the table,
and lead me where you will. Courage, bold Barnaby. We'll talk more of this. I've a fancy for you. Wait there till I come back. Now, widow.
She led him out at the door, and into the little garden, where they stopped. You are a fit agent, she said, in a half-breathless manner, and well represent the man who sent you here.
I tell him that you said so, Stagg retorted. He has a regard for you, and will respect me the more, if possible, for your praise. We must have our rights, widow.
Rights? Do you know, she said, that a word from me—
Why do you stop?
returned the blind man calmly, after a long pause.
Do I know that a word from you would place my friend in the last position of the dance of life? Yes, I do. What of that? It will never be spoken, widow.
You are sure of that?
Quite. So sure that I don't come here to discuss the question. I say we must have our rights, or we must be bought off. Keep to that point, or let me return to my young friend, for I have an interest in the lad, and desire to put him in the way of making his fortune. Pah! You needn't speak, he added hastily. I know what you would say. You have hinted at it once already. Have I no feeling for you because I am blind? No, I have not. Why do you expect me, being in darkness, to be better than men who have their sight? Why should you? Is the hand of heaven more manifest in my having no eyes than in your having two? It's the cant of you folks to be horrified if a blind man robs, or lies, or steals. Oh, yes, it's far worse in him, who can barely live on the few halfpence that are thrown to him in the streets, than in you, who can see and work, and are not dependent on the mercies of the world. A curse on you! You, who have 5 senses, may be wicked at your pleasure. We who have 4, and want the most important, ought to live and be moral on our affliction. The true charity and justice of rich to poor, all the world over.
He paused a moment when he had said these words, and caught the sound of money jingling in her hand.
Well,
he cried, quickly resuming his former manner,
that should lead to something. The point, widow.
First, answer me one question, she replied. You say he is close at hand. Has he left London?
Being close at hand, widow, it would seem he has, returned the blind man.
I mean, for good. You know that.
Yes, for good. The truth is, widow, that his making a longer stay there might have had disagreeable consequences. He has come away for that reason.
Listen, said the widow, telling some money out upon a bench beside them. Count.
6,
said the blind man, listening attentively.
Any more?
They
are the savings,' she answered, 'of 5 years. 6 guineas.' He put out his hand for one of the coins, felt it carefully, put it between his teeth, rung it on the bench, and nodded to her to proceed. 'These have been scraped together and laid by, lest sickness or death should separate my son and me. They have been purchased at the price of much hunger, hard labour, and want of rest. If you can take them, do, on condition that you leave this place upon the instant, and enter no more into that room where he sits now, expecting your return.' 6 guineas, said the blind man, shaking his head, though of the fullest weight that were ever coined, fall very far short of 20 pounds, widow. For such a sum, as you know, I must write to a distant part of the country. To do that, and receive an answer, I must have time.' 2 days, said Stagg. 'More.' 4 days. 'A week. Return on this day week, at the same hour, but not to the house. Wait at the corner of the lane.' 'Of course,' said the blind man, with a crafty look. 'I shall find you there.' 'Where else can I take refuge? Is it not enough that you have made a beggar of me, and that I have sacrificed my whole store, so hardly earned, to preserve this home?' 'Pshaw!' said the blind man, after some consideration. 'Set me with my face towards the point you speak of, and in the middle of the road. Is this the spot?' 'It is.' 'On this day week at sunset, and think of him within doors. For the present, good night.' She made him no answer, nor did he stop for any. He went slowly away, turning his head from time to time, and stopping to listen, as if he were curious to know whether he was watched by any one. The shadows of night were closing fast around, and he was soon lost in the gloom. It was not, however, until she had traversed the lane from end to end, and made sure that he was gone, that she re-entered the cottage, and hurriedly barred the door and window.
'Mother,' said Barnaby, 'what is the matter? Where is the blind man?'
'He is gone.'
'Gone!' he cried, starting up. 'I must have more talk with him. Which way did he take?'
'I don't know,' she answered, folding her arms about him. 'You must not go out to-night. There are ghosts and dreams abroad.'
'Aye,'
said Barnaby, in a frightened whisper.
'it is not safe to stir. We must leave this place to-morrow.' 'This place? This cottage and the little garden, mother?'
'Yes. To-morrow morning at sunrise we must travel to London, lose ourselves in that wide place. There would be some trace of us in any other town, then travel on again and find some new abode.' Little persuasion was required to reconcile Barnaby to anything that promised change. In another minute he was wild with delight, in another full of grief at the prospect of parting with his friends the dogs, in another wild again. Then he was fearful of what she had said to prevent his wandering abroad that night, and full of terrors and strange questions. His light-heartedness in the end surmounted all his other feelings, and lying down in his clothes, to the end that he might be ready on the morrow, he soon fell fast asleep before the poor turf fire. His mother did not close her eyes, but sat beside him, watching. Every breath of wind sounded in her ears like that dreaded footstep at the door, or like that hand upon the latch, and made the calm summer night a night of horror. At length the welcome day appeared. When she had made the little preparations which were needful for their journey, and had prayed upon her knees with many tears, she roused Barnaby, who jumped up gaily at her summons. His clothes were few enough, and to carry Grip was a labour of love. As the sun shed his earliest beams upon the earth, they closed the door of their deserted home, and turned away. The sky was blue and bright, the air was fresh and filled with 1,000 perfumes. Barnaby looked upward, and laughed with all his heart. But it was a day he usually devoted to a long ramble, and one of the dogs, the ugliest of them all, came bounding up and jumping round him in the fullness of his joy. He had to bid him go back in a surly tone, and his heart smote him while he did so. The dog retreated, turned with a half incredulous, half imploring look, came a little back, and stopped. It was the last appeal of an old companion and a faithful friend, cast off. Barnaby could bear no more, and as he shook his head and waved his playmate home, he burst into tears.
"Oh, mother, mother, how mournful he will be when he scratches the door and finds it always shut!"
There was such a sense of home in the thought, that though her own eyes overflowed, she would not have obliterated the recollection of it, either from her own mind or from his, for the wealth of the whole wide world. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 47. In the exhaustless catalogue of heaven's mercies to mankind, the power we have of finding some germs of comfort in the hardest trials must ever occupy the foremost place, not only because it supports and upholds us when we most require to be sustained, but because in this source of consolation there is something, we have reason to believe, of the divine spirit, something of that goodness which detects amidst our own evil doings a redeeming quality, something which even in our fallen nature we possess in common with the angels, which had its being in the old time when they trod the earth, and lingers on it yet, in pity. How often on their journey did the widow remember with a grateful heart that out of his deprivation Barnaby's cheerfulness and affection sprung. How often did she call to mind that but for that he might have been sullen, morose, unkind, far removed from her, vicious perhaps, and cruel. How often had she cause for comfort in his strength and hope and in his simple nature. Those feeble powers of mind which rendered him so soon forgetful of the past, save in brief gleams and flashes, even they were a comfort now. The world to him was full of happiness. In every tree and plant and flower, in every bird and beast and tiny insect whom a breath of summer wind laid low upon the ground, he had delight. His delight was hers, and where many a wise son would have made her sorrowful, this poor light-hearted idiot filled her breast with thankfulness and love. Their stock of money was low, but from the hoard she had told into the blind man's hand, the widow had withheld 1 guinea. This, with the few pence she possessed besides, was to 2 persons of their frugal habits a goodly sum in bank. Moreover, they had Grip in company, and when they must otherwise have changed the guinea, it was but to make him exhibit outside an alehouse door, or in a village street, or in the grounds or gardens of a mansion of the better sort, and scores who would have given nothing in charity were ready to bargain for more amusement from the talking bird. One day, for they moved slowly, and although they had many rides in carts and waggons, were on the road a week, Barnaby, with Grip upon his shoulder and his mother following, begged permission at a trim lodge to go up to the great house at the other end of the avenue and show his raven. The man within was inclined to give them admittance, and was indeed about to do so, when a stout gentleman with a long whip in his hand and a flushed face which seemed to indicate that he had had his morning's draught, rode up to the gate and called in a loud voice and with more oaths than the occasion seemed to warrant, to have it opened directly.
"Who hast thou got here?"
said the gentleman angrily, as the man threw the gate wide open and pulled off his hat.
"Who are these, eh? Art a beggar, woman?"
The widow answered with a curtsy that they were poor travellers.
"Vagrants," said the gentleman, "vagrants and vagabonds. Thee wish to be made acquainted with the cage, dost thee? The cage, the stocks, and the whipping post? Where dost come from?"
She told him in a timid manner, for he was very loud, hoarse, and red-faced, and besought him not to be angry, for they meant no harm, and would go upon their way that moment.
"Don't be too sure of that," replied the gentleman. "We don't allow vagrants to roam about this place. I know what thou wantest. Stray linen drying on hedges, and stray poultry, eh? What hast got in that basket, lazy hound?" "Grip, grip, grip, grip the clever, grip the wicked, grip the knowing, grip, grip, grip,"
cried the raven, whom Barnaby had shut up on the approach of this stern personage.
"I'm a devil, I'm a devil, I'm a devil, never say die, bow wow wow, Polly, put the kettle on, we'll all have tea, "Take the vermin out, scoundrel," said the gentleman, "and let me see him."
Barnaby, thus condescendingly addressed, produced his bird, but not without much fear and trembling, and set him down upon the ground, which he had no sooner done than Grip drew 50 corks at least, and then began to dance, at the same time eyeing the gentleman with surprising insolence of manner, and screwing his head so much on one side that he appeared desirous of screwing it off upon the spot. The cork-drawing seemed to make a greater impression on the gentleman's mind than the raven's power of speech, and was indeed particularly adapted to his habits and capacity. He desired to have that done again, but despite his being very peremptory, and notwithstanding that Barnaby coaxed to the utmost, Grip turned a deaf ear to the request, and preserved a dead silence.
"Bring him along," said the gentleman, pointing to the house.
But Grip, who had watched the action, anticipated his master by hopping on before them, constantly flapping his wings and screaming "Cook!" Meanwhile, as a hint perhaps that there was company coming and a small collation would be acceptable, Barnaby and his mother walked on either side of the gentleman on horseback, who surveyed each of them from time to time in a proud and coarse manner, and occasionally thundered out some question, the tone of which alarmed Barnaby so much that he could find no answer, and, as a matter of course, could make him no reply. On one of these occasions, when the gentleman appeared disposed to exercise his horsewhip, the widow ventured to inform him in a low voice and with tears in her eyes that her son was of weak mind.
"An idiot, eh?" said the gentleman, looking at Barnaby as he spoke. "And how long hast thou been an idiot?"
"She knows," was Barnaby's timid answer, pointing to his mother. "I always, I believe." "From his birth," said the widow.
"I don't believe it," cried the gentleman. "Not a bit of it. It's an excuse not to work. There's nothing like flogging to cure that disorder. I'd make a difference in him in 10 minutes, I'll be bound."
"Heaven has made none in more than twice 10 years, sir," said the widow mildly.
"Then why don't you shut him up? We pay enough for county institutions, damn him. But thou'd rather drag him about to excite charity, of course. Aye, I know thee."
Now, this gentleman had various endearing appellations among his intimate friends. By some he was called a country gentleman of the true school, by some a fine old country gentleman, by some a sporting gentleman, by some a thoroughbred Englishman, by some a genuine John Bull. But they all agreed in one respect, and that was that it was a pity they were not more like him, and that because they were not, the country was going to rack and ruin every day. He was in the commission of the peace, and could write his name almost legibly, but his greatest qualifications were that he was more severe with poachers, was a better shot, a harder rider, had better horses, kept better dogs, could eat more solid food, drink more strong wine, go to bed every night more drunk, and get up every morning more sober, than any man in the county. In knowledge of horseflesh he was almost equal to a farrier. In stable learning he surpassed his own head groom, and in gluttony not a pig on his estate was a match for him. He had no seat in Parliament himself, but he was extremely patriotic, and usually drove his voters up to the poll with his own hands. He was warmly attached to church and state, and never appointed to the living in his gift any but a 3-bottle man and a first-rate fox-hunter. He mistrusted the honesty of all poor people who could read and write, and had a secret jealousy of his own wife, a young lady whom he had married for what his friends called the good old English reason that her father's property adjoined his own, for possessing those accomplishments in a greater degree than himself. In short, Barnaby being an idiot, and Grip a creature of mere brute instinct, it would be very hard to say what this gentleman was. He rode up to the door of a handsome house, approached by a great flight of steps, where a man was waiting to take his horse, and led the way into a large hall, which, spacious as it was tainted with the fumes of last night's stale debauch. Greatcoats, riding-whips, bridles, top-boots, spurs, and such gear were strewn about on all sides, and formed, with some huge stag's antlers and a few portraits of dogs and horses, its principal embellishments. Throwing himself into a great chair, in which, by the by, he often snored away the night, when he had been, according to his admirers, a finer country gentleman than usual, he bade the man to tell his mistress to come down. And presently there appeared, a little flurried, as it seemed, by the unwonted summons, a lady much younger than himself, who had the appearance of being in delicate health and not too happy.
"Here, thou'st no delight in following the hounds, as an Englishwoman should have," said the gentleman. "See to this here. That'll please thee, perhaps." The lady smiled, sat down at a little distance from him, and glanced at Barnaby with a look of pity. "He's an idiot, the woman says," observed the gentleman, shaking his head. "I don't believe it." "Are you his mother?" asked the lady. She answered yes. "What's the use of asking her?" said the gentleman, thrusting his hands into his breeches pockets. "She'll tell thee so, of course. Most likely he's hired at so much a day. There, get on, make him do something." Grip, having by this time recovered his urbanity, condescended, at Barnaby's solicitation, to repeat his various phrases of speech, and to go through the whole of his performances with the utmost success. The corks and the never say die afforded the gentleman so much delight that he demanded the repetition of this part of the entertainment, until Grip got into his basket and positively refused to say another word, good or bad. The lady, too, was much amused with him, and the closing point of his obstinacy so delighted her husband that he burst into a roar of laughter and demanded his price. Barnaby looked as though he didn't understand his meaning. Probably he did not. "His price," said the gentleman, rattling the money in his pockets. "What dost want for him? How much?" "He's not to be sold," replied Barnaby, shutting up the basket in a great hurry, and throwing the strap over his shoulder. "Mother, come away." "Thou seest how much of an idiot he is, book learner," said the gentleman, looking scornfully at his wife. "He can make a bargain. What dost want for him, old woman?"
"He is my son's constant companion," said the widow. "He is not to be sold, sir, indeed."
"Not to be sold!"
cried the gentleman, growing 10 times redder, hoarser, and louder than before.
"Not to be sold!"
"Indeed, no," she answered. "We have never thought of parting with him, sir, I do assure you."
He was evidently about to make a very passionate retort, when a few murmured words from his wife happening to catch his ear, he turned sharply round and said,
"Eh? What?"
"We can hardly expect them to sell the bird against their own desire," she faltered. "If they prefer to keep him—"
"Prefer to keep him?" he echoed. "These people who go tramping about the country, a-pilfering and vagabondizing on all hands, prefer to keep a bird when a landed proprietor and a justice asks his price. That old woman's been to school. I know she has. Don't tell me no," he roared to the widow. "I say yes."
Barnaby's mother pleaded guilty to the accusation, and hoped there was no harm in it.
"No harm," said the gentleman. "No harm, ye old rebel. Not a bit of harm. If my clerk was here, I'd set ye in the stocks, I would, or lay ye in jail for prowling up and down on the look-out for petty larcenies, ye limb of a gipsy. Here, Simon, put these pilferers out, shove 'em into the road, out with 'em. Ye don't want to sell the bird, ye that come here to beg, don't ye? If they aren't out in double quick, set the dogs upon 'em. They waited for no further dismissal, but fled precipitately, leaving the gentleman to storm away by himself, for the poor lady had already retreated, and making a great many vain attempts to silence Grip, who, excited by the noise, drew corks enough for a city feast, as they hurried down the avenue, and appeared to congratulate himself beyond measure on having been the cause of the disturbance. When they had nearly reached the lodge, another servant emerging from the shrubbery feigned to be very active in ordering them off, but this man put a crown into the widow's hand, and whispering that his lady sent it, thrust them gently from the gate. This incident only suggested to the widow's mind, when they halted at an alehouse some miles further on, and heard the justice's character as given by his friends, that perhaps something more than capacity of stomach and tastes for the kennel and the stable were required to form either a perfect country gentleman, a thoroughbred Englishman, or a genuine John Bull, and that possibly the terms were sometimes misappropriated, not to say disgraced. She little thought then that a circumstance so slight would ever influence their future fortunes, but time and experience enlightened her in this respect.
"Mother,"
said Barnaby, as they were sitting next day in a waggon which was to take them within 10 miles of the capital,
"we're going to London first, you said. Shall we see that blind man there?"
She was about to answer, "Heaven forbid," but checked herself, and told him no, she thought not. Why did he ask?
"He's a wise man,"
said Barnaby, with a thoughtful countenance.
"I wish that we may meet with him again. What was it that he said of crowds? That gold was to be found where people crowded, and not among the trees and in such quiet places. He spoke as if he loved it. London is a crowded place. I think we shall meet him there."
"But why do you desire to see him, love?" she asked.
"Because,"
said Barnaby, looking wistfully at her,
"he talked to me about gold, which is a rare thing, and say what you will, a thing you would like to have, I know. And because he came and went away so strangely, just as white-headed old men come sometimes to my bed's foot in the night, and say what I can't remember when the bright day returns, he told me he'd come back. I wonder why he broke his word." "But you never thought of being rich or gay before, dear Barnaby. You have always been contented." He laughed, and bade her say that again, then cried, "Ay, ay, oh, yes!"
and laughed once more. Then something passed that caught his fancy, and the topic wandered from his mind, and was succeeded by another just as fleeting. But it was plain from what he had said, and from his returning to the point more than once that day, and on the next, that the blind man's visit, and indeed his words, had taken strong possession of his mind. Whether the idea of wealth had occurred to him for the first time on looking at the golden clouds that evening, and images were often presented to his thoughts by outward objects quite as remote and distant, or whether their poor and humble way of life had suggested it, by contrast, long ago, or whether the accident, as he would deem it, of the blind man's pursuing the current of his own remarks, had done so at the moment, or he had been impressed by the mere circumstance of the man being blind, and therefore, unlike any one with whom he had talked before, it was impossible to tell. She tried every means to discover, but in vain, and the probability is that Barnaby himself was equally in the dark. It filled her with uneasiness to find him harping on this string, but all that she could do was to lead him quickly to some other subject, and to dismiss it from his brain. To caution him against their visitor, to show any fear or suspicion in reference to him, would only be, she feared, to increase that interest with which Barnaby regarded him, and to strengthen his desire to meet him once again. She hoped, by plunging into the crowd, to rid herself of her terrible pursuer, and then, by journeying to a distance and observing increased caution, if that were possible, to live again unknown in secrecy and peace. They reached in course of time their halting place within 10 miles of London, and lay there for the night, after bargaining to be carried on for a trifle next day in a light van which was returning empty and was to start at 5 o'clock in the morning. The driver was punctual, the road good, save for the dust, the weather being very hot and dry, and at 7 in the forenoon of Friday, the 2nd of June, 1780, they alighted at the foot of Westminster Bridge, bade their conductor farewell, and stood alone together on the scorching pavement. For the freshness which night sheds upon such busy thoroughfares had already departed, and the sun was shining with uncommon lustre. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 48. Uncertain where to go next, and bewildered by the crowd of people who were already astir, they sat down in one of the recesses on the bridge to rest. They soon became aware that the stream of life was all pouring one way, and that a vast throng of persons were crossing the river, from the Middlesex to the Surrey shore, in unusual haste and evident excitement. They were, for the most part, in knots of 2 or 3, or sometimes half a dozen. They spoke little together. Many of them were quite silent, and hurried on as if they had one absorbing object in view, which was common to them all. They were surprised to see that nearly every man in this great concourse, which still came pouring past without slackening in the least, wore in his hat a blue cockade, and that the chance passengers who were not so decorated appeared timidly anxious to escape observation or attack, and gave them the wall as if they would conciliate them. This, however, was natural enough, considering their inferiority in point of numbers, for the proportion of those who wore blue cockades to those who were dressed as usual was at least 40 or 50 to 1. There was no quarrelling, however. The blue cockades went swarming on, passing each other when they could, and making all the speed that was possible in such a multitude, and exchanged nothing more than looks, and very often not even those, with such of the passers-by as were not of their number. At first the current of people had been confined to the 2 pathways, and but a few more eager stragglers kept the road. But after half an hour or so, the passage was completely blocked up by the great press, which, being now closely wedged together, and impeded by the carts and coaches it encountered, moved but slowly, and were sometimes at a stand for 5 or 10 minutes together. After the lapse of nearly 2 hours, the numbers began to diminish visibly, and gradually dwindling away, by little and little, left the bridge quite clear, save that now and then some hot and dusty man, with the cockade in his hat and his coat thrown over his shoulder, went panting by, fearful of being too late, or stopped to ask which way his friends had taken, and being directed, hastened on again like one refreshed. In this comparative solitude, which seemed quite strange and novel after the late crowd, the widow had for the first time an opportunity of inquiring of an old man who came and sat beside them what was the meaning of that great assemblage.
"Why, where have you come from?" he returned, "that you haven't heard of Lord George Gordon's great association? This is the day that he presents a petition against the Catholics. God bless him."
"What have all these men to do with that?" she said.
"What have they to do with it?" the old man replied. "Why, how you talk! Don't you know his lordship has declared he won't present it to the house at all, unless it is attended to the door by 40,000 good and true men at least? There's a crowd for you."
"A crowd indeed," said Barnaby. "Do you hear that, mother?"
"And they're mustering yonder, as I am told," resumed the old man, nigh upon 100,000 strong. Ah, let Lord George alone. He knows his power. There'll be a good many faces inside them 3 windows over there,' and he pointed to where the House of Commons overlooked the river, 'that'll turn pale when good Lord George gets up this afternoon. And with reason too. Aye, aye, let his lordship alone. Let him alone. He knows.' And so, with much mumbling and chuckling and shaking of his forefinger, he rose with the assistance of his stick and tottered off.
'Mother,' said Barnaby, 'that's a brave crowd he talks of. Come.'
'Not to join it?' cried his mother.
'Yes, yes,' he answered, plucking at her sleeve. 'Why not? Come.'
'You don't know,' she urged, 'what mischief they may do, where they may lead you, what their meaning is.
Dear Barnaby, for my sake.' 'For your sake!' he cried, patting her hand. 'Well, it is for your sake, mother. You remember what the blind man said about the gold. Here's a brave crowd. Come, or wait till I come back. Yes, yes, yes. Wait here.'
She tried with all the earnestness her fears engendered to turn him from his purpose, but in vain. He was stooping down to buckle on his shoe, when a hackney coach passed them rather quickly, and a voice inside called to the driver to stop. 'Young man,' said a voice within.
'Who's that?'
cried Barnaby, looking up.
'Do you wear this ornament?'
returned the stranger, holding out a blue cockade.
'In heaven's name, no. Pray do not give it him,'
exclaimed the widow.
'Speak for yourself, woman,'
said the man within the coach coldly.
'Leave the young man to his choice. He's old enough to make it, and to snap your apron strings. He knows without your telling whether he wears the sign of a loyal Englishman or not.'
Barnaby, trembling with impatience, cried,
'Yes, yes, yes, I do,'
as he had cried a dozen times already. The man threw him a cockade, and crying,
'Make haste to St George's Fields,'
ordered the coachman to drive on fast, and left them. With hands that trembled with his eagerness to fix the bauble in his hat, Barnaby was adjusting it as best he could, and hurriedly replying to the tears and entreaties of his mother, when 2 gentlemen passed on the opposite side of the way. Observing them, and seeing how Barnaby was occupied, they stopped, whispered together for an instant, turned back, and came over to them. 'Why are you sitting here?' said one of them, who was dressed in a plain suit of black, wore long lank hair, and carried a great cane. 'Why have you not gone with the rest?'
'I am going, sir,'
replied Barnaby, finishing his task, and putting his hat on with an air of pride.
'I shall be there directly.'
'Say my lord, young man, when his lordship does you the honour of speaking to you,' said the second gentleman mildly. 'If you don't know Lord George Gordon when you see him, it's high time you should.'
'Nay, Gashford,' said Lord George, as Barnaby pulled off his hat again and made him a low bow. 'It's no great matter on a day like this, which every Englishman will remember with delight and pride. Put on your hat, friend, and follow us, for you lag behind and are late. It's past 10 now. Didn't you know that the hour for assembling was 10 o'clock? Barnaby shook his head and looked vacantly from one to the other.
'You might have known it, friend,' said Gashford. 'It was perfectly understood. How came you to be so ill-informed?'
'He cannot tell you, sir,' the widow interposed. 'It's of no use to ask him. We are but this morning come from a long distance in the country, and know nothing of these matters.'
'The cause has taken a deep root, and has spread its branches far and wide,' said Lord George to his secretary. 'This is a pleasant hearing. I thank Heaven for it.'
'Amen!'
cried Gashford, with a solemn face.
'You do not understand me, my lord,' said the widow. 'Pardon me, but you cruelly mistake my meaning. We know nothing of these matters.
We have no desire or right to join in what you are about to do. This is my son, my poor afflicted son, dearer to me than my own life. In mercy's name, my lord, go your way alone, and do not tempt him into danger.'
'My good woman,' said Gashford, 'how can you... Dear me, what do you mean by tempting and by danger? Do you think his lordship is a roaring lion going about and seeking whom he may devour? God bless me!'
'No, no, my lord, forgive me,' implored the widow, laying both her hands upon his breast, and scarcely knowing what she did or said in the earnestness of her supplication. 'But there are reasons why you should hear my earnest mother's prayer, and leave my son with me. Oh, do! He is not in his right senses. He is not, indeed.'
'It is a bad sign of the wickedness of these times,' said Lord George, evading her touch and colouring deeply, 'that those who cling to the truth and support the right cause are set down as mad. Have you the heart to say this of your own son? Unnatural mother!'
'I am astonished at you,' said Gashford, with a kind of meek severity. 'This is a very sad picture of female depravity.'
'He has surely no appearance,' said Lord George, glancing at Barnaby, and whispering in his secretary's ear, 'of being deranged. And even if he had, we must not construe any trifling peculiarity into madness. Which of us,' and here he turned red again, 'would be safe if that were made the law?'
'Not one,' replied the secretary. 'In that case, the greater the zeal, the truth, and talent, the more direct the call from above, the clearer would be the madness. With regard to this young man, my lord,' he added, with a lip that slightly curled as he looked at Barnaby, who stood twirling his hat and stealthily beckoning them to come away, 'he is as sensible and self-possessed as any one I ever saw.'
'And you desire to make one of this great body?' said Lord George, addressing him. 'And intended to make one, did you?' 'Yes, yes,' said Barnaby, with sparkling eyes. 'To be sure I did. I told her so myself.'
'I see,' replied Lord George, with a reproachful glance at the unhappy mother. 'I thought so. Follow me and this gentleman, and you shall have your wish.' Barnaby kissed his mother tenderly on the cheek, and bidding her to be of good cheer, for their fortunes were both made now, did as he was desired. She, poor woman, followed too, with how much fear and grief it would be hard to tell. They passed quickly through the Bridge Road, where the shops were all shut up, for the passage of the great crowd and the expectation of their return had alarmed the tradesmen for their goods and windows, and where in the upper stories all the inhabitants were congregated, looking down into the street below, with faces variously expressive of alarm, of interest, expectancy, and indignation. Some of these applauded, and some hissed, but regardless of these interruptions, for the noise of a vast congregation of people at a little distance sounded in his ears like the roaring of the sea, Lord George Gordon quickened his pace, and presently arrived before St. George's Fields. They were really fields at that time, and of considerable extent. Here an immense multitude was collected, bearing flags of various kinds and sizes, but all of the same colour, blue, like the cockades, some sections marching to and fro in military array, and others drawn up in circles, squares, and lines. A large portion, both of the bodies which paraded the ground, and of those which remained stationary, were occupied in singing hymns or psalms. With whomsoever this originated, it was well done, for the sound of so many thousand voices in the air must have stirred the heart of any man within him, and could not fail to have a wonderful effect upon enthusiasts, however mistaken. Scouts had been posted in advance of the great body, to give notice of their leader's coming. These falling back, the word was quickly passed through the whole host, and for a short interval there ensued a profound and death-like silence, during which the mass was so still and quiet that the fluttering of a banner caught the eye, and became a circumstance of note. Then they burst into a tremendous shout, into another, and another, and the air seemed rent and shaken as if by the discharge of cannon. "Gashford!" cried Lord George, pressing his secretary's arm tight within his own, and speaking with as much emotion in his voice as in his altered face. "I am called indeed now. I feel and know it. I am the leader of a host. If they summoned me at this moment with one voice to lead them on to death, I'd do it. Yes, and fall first myself."
"It is a proud sight," said the secretary. "It is a noble day for England, and for the great cause throughout the world. Such homage, my lord, as I, an humble but devoted man, can render."
"What are you doing?" cried his master, catching him by both hands, for he had made a show of kneeling at his feet. "Do not unfit me, dear Gashford, for the solemn duty of this glorious day." The tears stood in the eyes of the poor gentleman as he said the words. "Let us go among them. We have to find a place in some division for this new recruit. Give me your hand." Gashford slid his cold, insidious palm into his master's grasp, and so, hand in hand, and followed still by Barnaby, and by his mother too, they mingled with the concourse. They had by this time taken to their singing again, and as their leader passed between their ranks, they raised their voices to their utmost. Many of those who were banded together to support the religion of their country, even unto death, had never heard a hymn or psalm in all their lives. But these fellows, having for the most part strong lungs, and being naturally fond of singing, chanted any ribaldry or nonsense that occurred to them, feeling pretty certain that it would not be detected in the general chorus, and not caring much if it were. Many of these voluntaries were sung under the very nose of Lord George Gordon, who, quite unconscious of their burden, passed on with his usual stiff and solemn deportment, very much edified and delighted by the pious conduct of his followers. So they went on and on, up this line, down that, round the exterior of this circle, and on every side of that hollow square, and still there were lines, and squares, and circles out of number to review. The day being now intensely hot, and the sun striking down his fiercest rays upon the field, those who carried heavy banners began to grow faint and weary. Most of the number assembled were fain to pull off their neckcloths, and throw their coats and waistcoats open, and some, towards the centre, quite overpowered by the excessive heat, which was of course rendered more unendurable by the multitude around them, lay down upon the grass, and offered all they had about them for a drink of water. Still no man left the ground, not even of those who were so distressed. Still Lord George, streaming from every pore, went on with Gashford, and still Barnaby and his mother followed close behind them. They had arrived at the top of a long line of some 800 men in single file, and Lord George had turned his head to look back, when a loud cry of recognition, in that peculiar and half-stifled tone which a voice has when it is raised in the open air and in the midst of a great concourse of persons, was heard, and a man stepped with a shout of laughter from the rank, and smote Barnaby on the shoulders with his heavy hand. "Oh no!" he cried. "Barnaby Rudge! Why, where have you been hiding for these 100 years?" Barnaby had been thinking within himself that the smell of the trodden grass brought back his old days at cricket when he was a young boy and played on Chigwell Green. Confused by this sudden and boisterous address, he stared in a bewildered manner at the man, and could scarcely say, "What? You?" "You!" echoed the other. "Aye, you, Maypole, you! You remember my dog. He's alive now, and will know you, I warrant. What, you wear the colour, do you? Well done!" "You know this young man, I see," said Lord George. "Know him, my lord, as well as I know my own right hand. My captain knows him. We all know him."
Will you take him into your division? He hasn't in it a better, nor a nimbler, nor a more active man than Barnaby Rudge, said Hugh. Show me the man who says it has. Fall in, Barnaby. He shall march, my lord, between me and Dennis, and he shall carry,' he added, taking a flag from the hand of a tired man who tendered it, 'the gayest silken streamer in this valiant army.'
'In the name of God, no!' shrieked the widow, darting forward. 'Barnaby, my lord, see, he'll come back. Barnaby, Barnaby!'
'Women in the field!' cried Hugh, stepping between them and holding her off. 'Halloa! My captain there!'
'What's the matter here?'
cried Simon Tappertit, bustling up in a great heat.
'Do you call this order?'
'Nothing like it, captain,'
answered Hugh, still holding her back with his outstretched hand.
'It's against all orders. Ladies are carrying off our gallant soldiers from their duty. The word of command, captain. They're filing off the ground. Quick!' 'Close!' cried Simon, with the whole power of his lungs. 'Form! March!'
She was thrown to the ground. The whole field was in motion. Barnaby was whirled away into the heart of a dense mass of men, and she saw him no more. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 49. The mob had been divided from its first assemblage into 4 divisions: the London, the Westminster, the Southwark, and the Scotch. Each of these divisions being subdivided into various bodies, and these bodies being drawn up in various forms and figures. The general arrangement was, except to the few chiefs and leaders, as unintelligible as the plan of a great battle to the meanest soldier in the field. It was not without its method, however, for, in a very short space of time after being put in motion, the crowd had resolved itself into 3 great parties, and were prepared, as had been arranged, to cross the river by different bridges, and make for the House of Commons in separate detachments. At the head of that division which had Westminster Bridge for its approach to the scene of action, Lord George Gordon took his post, with Gashford at his right hand, and sundry ruffians of most unpromising appearance forming a kind of staff about him. The conduct of a second party, whose route lay by Blackfriars, was entrusted to a committee of management, including perhaps 12 men, while the third, which was to go by London Bridge, and through the main streets, in order that their numbers and their serious intentions might be the better known and appreciated by the citizens, were led by Simon Tappertit, assisted by a few subalterns selected from the Brotherhood of United Bulldogs, Dennis the hangman, Hugh, and some others. The word of command being given, each of these great bodies took the road assigned to it, and departed on its way in perfect order and profound silence. That which went through the city greatly exceeded the others in number, and was of such prodigious extent that when the rear began to move, the front was nearly 4 miles in advance, notwithstanding that the men marched 3 abreast, and followed very close upon each other. At the head of this party, in the place where Hugh, in the madness of his humour, had stationed him, and walking between that dangerous companion and the hangman, went Barnaby, as many a man among the thousands who looked on that day afterwards remembered well. Forgetful of all other things in the ecstasy of the moment, his face flushed and his eyes sparkling with delight, heedless of the weight of the great banner he carried, and mindful only of its flashing in the sun and rustling in the summer breeze, on he went, proud, happy, elated past all telling, the only light-hearted, undesigning creature in the whole assembly.
"What do you think of this?"
asked Hugh, as they passed through the crowded streets, and looked up at the windows which were thronged with spectators.
"They've all turned out to see our flags and streamers, eh, Barnaby? Why, Barnaby's the greatest man of all the pack. His flags are the largest of the lot, the brightest too. There's nothing in the show like Barnaby. All eyes are turned on him. Don't make that din, brother, growled the hangman, glancing with no very approving eyes at Barnaby as he spoke. I hope he don't think there's nothing to be done but carrying their piece of blue rag like a boy at a breaking up. You're ready for action, I hope, eh? You, I mean, he added, nudging Barnaby roughly with his elbow. What are you staring at? Why don't you speak? Barnaby had been gazing at his flag, and looked vacantly from his questioner to Hugh. He don't understand your way, said the latter. Here, I'll explain to him. Barnaby, old boy, attend to me.
I'll attend, said Barnaby, looking anxiously round, but I wish I could see her somewhere.
See you? Demanded Dennis in a gruff tone. You aren't in love, I hope, brother. That aren't the sort of thing for us, you know. We mustn't have no love here.
She would be proud indeed to see me now, eh, Hugh? Said Barnaby. Wouldn't it make her glad to see me at the head of this large show? She'd cry for joy. I know she would. Where can she be? She never sees me at my best, and what do I care to be gay and fine if she's not by?
Why, what palaver's this? Asked Mr Dennis, with supreme disdain. We ain't got no sentimental members among us, I hope. Don't be uneasy, brother, cried Hugh. He's only talking of his mother. Of his what? Said Mr Dennis with a strong oath. His mother. And have I combined myself with this here section, and turned out on this here memorable day to hear men talk about their mothers? Growled Mr Dennis with extreme disgust. The notion of a man's sweetheart's bad enough, but a man's mother. And here his disgust was so extreme that he spat upon the ground and could say no more. Barnaby's right, cried Hugh with a grin, and I say it. Look'ee, bold lad, if she's not here to see, it's because I provided for her, and sent 6 gentlemen, every one of them with a blue flag, but not half as fine as yours, to take her in state to a grand house all hung round with gold and silver banners and everything else you please, where she'll wait till you come, and want for nothing.
Aye, said Barnaby, his face beaming with delight. Have you indeed? That's a good hearing. That's fine. Oh, kind Hugh.
But nothing of what will come, bless you, retorted Hugh with a wink at Dennis, who regarded his new companion in arms with great astonishment.
No, indeed, cried Barnaby.
Nothing at all, said Hugh. Money, cocked hats and feathers, red coats and gold lace, all the fine things there are, ever were or will be, will belong to us, if we are true to that noble gentleman, the best man in the world, carry our flags for a few days and keep 'em safe. That's all we've got to do.
Is that all?
cried Barnaby with glistening eyes, as he clutched his pole the tighter.
I warrant you I keep this one safe, then. You have put it in good hands. You know me, Hugh. Nobody shall wrest this flag away.
Well said, cried Hugh. Ha, nobly said. That's the old stout Barnaby that I've climbed and leapt with many and many a day. I knew I was not mistaken in Barnaby. Don't you see, man, he added in a whisper as he slipped to the other side of Dennis, that the lad's a natural, and can be got to do anything, if you take him the right way. Letting alone the funny is, he's worth 12 men in earnest, as you'd find, if you tried to fall with him. Leave him to me. You shall soon see whether he's of use or not.
Mr Dennis received these explanatory remarks with many nods and winks, and softened his behaviour towards Barnaby from that moment. Hugh, laying his finger on his nose, stepped back into his former place, and they proceeded in silence. It was between 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the 3 great parties met at Westminster, and, uniting into one huge mass, raised a tremendous shout. This was not only done in token of their presence, but as a signal to those on whom the task devolved, that it was time to take possession of the lobbies of both houses, and of the various avenues of approach, and of the gallery stairs. To the last named place, Hugh and Dennis, still with their pupil between them, rushed straightway. Barnaby having given his flag into the hands of one of their own party, who kept them at the outer door, their followers pressed on behind. They were borne as on a great wave to the very doors of the gallery, whence it was impossible to retreat, even if they had been so inclined, by reason of the throng which choked up the passages. It is a familiar expression in describing a great crowd, that a person might have walked upon the people's heads. In this case it was actually done. For a boy who had by some means got among the concourse, and was in imminent danger of suffocation, climbed to the shoulders of a man beside him, and walked upon the people's hats and heads into the open street, traversing in his passage the whole length of 2 staircases and a long gallery. Nor was the swarm without less dense, for a basket which had been tossed into the crowd was jerked from head to head and shoulder to shoulder, and went spinning and whirling on above them until it was lost to view, without ever once falling in among them or coming near the ground. Through this vast throng, sprinkled doubtless here and there with honest zealots, but composed for the most part of the very scum and refuse of London, whose growth was fostered by bad criminal laws, bad prison regulations, and the worst conceivable police, such of the members of both Houses of Parliament as had not taken the precaution to be already at their posts, were compelled to fight and force their way. Their carriages were stopped and broken, the wheels wrenched off, the glasses shivered to atoms, the panels beaten in, drivers, footmen, and masters pulled from their seats and rolled in the mud. Lords, commoners, and reverend bishops, with little distinction of person or party, were kicked and pinched and hustled, passed from hand to hand through various stages of ill usage, and sent to their fellow senators at last, with their clothes hanging in ribbons about them, their bagwigs torn off, themselves speechless and breathless, and their persons covered with the powder which had been cuffed and beaten out of their hair. One lord was so long in the hands of the populace that the peers as a body resolved to sally forth and rescue him, and were in the act of doing so when he happily appeared among them covered with dirt and bruises, and hardly to be recognized by those who knew him best. The noise and uproar were on the increase every moment. The air was filled with execrations, hoots, and howlings. The mob raged and roared like a mad monster as it was, unceasingly, and each new outrage served to swell its fury. Within doors matters were even yet more threatening. Lord George, preceded by a man who carried the immense petition on a porter's knot through the lobby to the door of the House of Commons, where it was received by 2 officers of the House, who rolled it up to the table ready for presentation, had taken his seat at an early hour before the Speaker went to prayers. His followers pouring in at the same time, the lobby and all the avenues were immediately filled, as we have seen. Thus the members were not only attacked in their passage through the streets, but were set upon within the very walls of Parliament, while the tumult both within and without was so great that those who attempted to speak could scarcely hear their own voices, far less consult upon the course it would be wise to take in such extremity, or animate each other to dignified and firm resistance. So sure as any member, just arrived, with dress disordered and dishevelled hair, came struggling through the crowd in the lobby, it yelled and screamed in triumph, and when the door of the house, partially and cautiously opened by those within for his admission, gave them a momentary glimpse of the interior, they grew more wild and savage, like beasts at the sight of prey, and made a rush against the portal, which strained its locks and bolts in their staples, and shook the very beams. The strangers' gallery, which was immediately above the door of the house, had been ordered to be closed on the first rumour of disturbance, and was empty, save that now and then Lord George took his seat there, for the convenience of coming to the head of the stairs which led to it, and repeating to the people what had passed within. It was on these stairs that Barnaby, Hugh, and Dennis were posted. There were 2 flights, short, steep, and narrow, running parallel to each other, and leading to 2 little doors communicating with a low passage which opened on the gallery. Between them was a kind of well, or unglazed skylight, for the admission of light and air into the lobby, which might be some 18 or 20 feet below. Upon one of these little staircases, not that at the head of which Lord George appeared from time to time, but the other, Gashford stood with his elbow on the banister, and his cheek resting on his hand, with his usual crafty aspect. Whenever he varied this attitude in the slightest degree, so much as by the gentlest motion of his arm, the uproar was certain to increase, not merely there, but in the lobby below, from which place no doubt some man who acted as fugleman to the rest was constantly looking up and watching him. "Order!" cried Hugh in a voice which made itself heard even above the roar and tumult, as Lord George appeared at the top of the staircase. "News! News from my lord!" The noise continued, notwithstanding his appearance, until Gashford looked round. There was silence immediately, even among the people in the passages without, and on the other staircases, who could neither see nor hear, but to whom, notwithstanding, the signal was conveyed with marvellous rapidity. "Gentlemen," said Lord George, who was very pale and agitated, "we must be firm. They talk of delays, but we must have no delays. They talk of taking your petition into consideration next Tuesday, but we must have it considered now. Present appearances look bad for our success, but we must succeed, and will." "We must succeed, and will," echoed the crowd. And so among their shouts and cheers and other cries, he bowed to them and retired, and presently came back again. There was another gesture from Gashford, and a dead silence directly. "I am afraid," he said this time, "that we have little reason, gentlemen, to hope for any redress from the proceedings of Parliament. But we must redress our own grievances. We must meet again. We must put our trust in Providence, and it will bless our endeavours." This speech, being a little more temperate than the last, was not so favourably received. When the noise and exasperation were at their height, he came back once more, and told him that the alarm had gone forth for many miles round, that when the king heard of their assembling together in that great body, he had no doubt his Majesty would send down private orders to have their wishes complied with, and, with the manner of his speech as childish, irresolute, and uncertain as his matter, was proceeding in this strain, when two gentlemen suddenly appeared at the door where he stood, and pressing past him, and coming a step or two lower down upon the stairs, confronted the people. The boldness of this action quite took them by surprise. They were not the less disconcerted when one of the gentlemen, turning to Lord George, spoke thus, in a loud voice, that they might hear him well, but quite coolly and collectedly. "You may tell these people, if you please, my lord, that I am General Conway, of whom they have heard, and that I oppose this petition and all their proceedings, and yours. I am a soldier, you may tell them, and I will protect the freedom of this place with my sword. You see, my lord, that the members of this house are all in arms to-day. You know that the entrance to it is a narrow one. You cannot be ignorant that there are men within these walls who are determined to defend that pass to the last, and before whom many lives must fall if your adherents persevere. Have a care what you do." "And, my Lord George," said the other gentleman, addressing him in like manner, "I desire them to hear this from me, Colonel Gordon, your near relation. If a man among this crowd, whose uproar strikes us deaf, crosses the threshold of the House of Commons, I swear to run my sword that moment, not into his, but into your body." With that, they stepped back again, keeping their faces towards the crowd, took each an arm of the misguided nobleman, drew him into the passage, and shut the door, which they directly locked and fastened on the inside. This was so quickly done, and the demeanour of both gentlemen, who were not young men either, was so gallant and resolute, that the crowd faltered and stared at each other with irresolute and timid looks. Many tried to turn towards the door. Some of the faintest hearted cried they had best go back, and called to those behind to give way, and the panic and confusion were increasing rapidly, when Gashford whispered Hugh. "What now?" Hugh roared aloud, turning towards them. "Why go back? Where can you do better than here, boys? One good rush against these doors and one below at the same time will do the business. Rush on, then. As to the door below, let those stand back who are afraid. Let those who are not afraid try who shall be the first to pass it. Here goes. Look out down there." Without the delay of an instant, he threw himself headlong over the banisters into the lobby below. He had hardly touched the ground when Barnaby was at his side. The chaplain's assistant and some members who were imploring the people to retire immediately withdrew, and then, with a great shout, both crowds threw themselves against the doors pell-mell and besieged the house in earnest. At that moment, when a second onset must have brought them into collision with those who stood on the defences within, in which case great loss of life and bloodshed would inevitably have ensued, the hindmost portion of the crowd gave way, and the rumour spread from mouth to mouth that a messenger had been dispatched by water for the military, who were forming in the street. Fearful of sustaining a charge in the narrow passages in which they were so closely wedged together, the throng poured out as impetuously as they had flocked in. As the whole stream turned at once, Barnaby and Hugh went with it, and so, fighting and struggling and trampling on fallen men and being trampled on in turn themselves, they and the whole mass floated by degrees into the open street, where a large detachment of the guards, both horse and foot, came hurrying up, clearing the ground before them so rapidly that the people seemed to melt away as they advanced. The word of command to halt being given, the soldiers formed across the street. The rioters, breathless and exhausted with their late exertions, formed likewise, though in a very irregular and disorderly manner. The commanding officer rode hastily into the open space between the two bodies, accompanied by a magistrate and an officer of the House of Commons, for whose accommodation a couple of troopers had hastily dismounted. The riot act was read, but not a man stirred. In the first rank of the insurgents, Barnaby and Hugh stood side by side. Somebody had thrust into Barnaby's hands when he came out into the street his precious flag, which, being now rolled up and tied round the pole, looked like a giant quarterstaff as he grasped it firmly and stood upon his guard. If ever man believed with his whole heart and soul that he was engaged in a just cause, and that he was bound to stand by his leader to the last, poor Barnaby believed it of himself and Lord George Gordon. After an ineffectual attempt to make himself heard, the magistrate gave the word, and the horse guards came riding in among the crowd. But even then, he galloped here and there, exhorting the people to disperse, and although heavy stones were thrown at the men, and some were desperately cut and bruised, they had no orders but to make prisoners of such of the rioters as were the most active, and to drive the people back with the flat of their sabres. As the horses came in among them, the throng gave way at many points, and the guards, following up their advantage, were rapidly clearing the ground, when 2 or 3 of the foremost, who were in a manner cut off from the rest by the people closing round them, made straight towards Barnaby and Hugh, who had no doubt been pointed out as the 2 men who dropped into the lobby. Laying about them now with some effect, and inflicting on the more turbulent of their opponents a few slight flesh wounds, under the influence of which a man dropped here and there into the arms of his fellows amid much groaning and confusion. At the sight of gashed and bloody faces, seen for a moment in the crowd, then hidden by the press around them, Barnaby turned pale and sick. But he stood his ground, and grasping his pole more firmly yet, kept his eye fixed upon the nearest soldier, nodding his head meanwhile as Hugh, with a scowling visage, whispered in his ear. The soldier came spurring on, making his horse rear as the people pressed about him, cutting at the hands of those who would have grasped his rein and forced his charger back, and waving to his comrades to follow. And still Barnaby, without retreating an inch, waited for his coming. Some called to him to fly, and some were in the very act of closing round him to prevent his being taken, when the pole swept into the air above the people's heads, and the man's saddle was empty in an instant. Then he and Hugh turned and fled, the crowd opening to let them pass, and closing up again so quickly that there was no clue to the course they had taken. Panting for breath, hot, dusty, and exhausted with fatigue, they reached the riverside in safety, and getting into a boat with all dispatch, were soon out of any immediate danger. As they glided down the river, they plainly heard the people cheering, and supposing they might have forced the soldiers to retreat, lay upon their oars for a few minutes, uncertain whether to return or not. But the crowd passing along Westminster Bridge soon assured them that the populace were dispersing, and Hugh rightly guessed from this that they had cheered the magistrate for offering to dismiss the military on condition of their immediate departure to their several homes, and that he and Barnaby were better where they were. He advised, therefore, that they should proceed to Blackfriars, and, going ashore at the bridge, make the best of their way to the Boot, where there was not only good entertainment and safe lodging, but where they would certainly be joined by many of their late companions. Barnaby assenting, they decided on this course of action, and pulled for Blackfriars accordingly. They landed at a critical time, and fortunately for themselves at the right moment, for, coming into Fleet Street, they found it in an unusual stir, and inquiring the cause, were told that a body of horse guards had just galloped past, and that they were escorting some rioters whom they had made prisoners to Newgate for safety. Not at all ill-pleased to have so narrowly escaped the cavalcade, they lost no more time in asking questions, but hurried to the Boot with as much speed as Hugh considered it prudent to make, without appearing singular or attracting an inconvenient share of public notice. End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 50. They were among the first to reach the tavern, but they had not been there many minutes when several groups of men who had formed part of the crowd came straggling in. Among them were Simon Tappertit and Mr. Dennis, both of whom, but especially the latter, greeted Barnaby with the utmost warmth, and paid him many compliments on the prowess he had shown.
"Which,"
said Dennis with an oath, as he rested his bludgeon in a corner with his hat upon it, and took his seat at the same table with them,
"it does me good to think of. There was an opportunity, but it led to nothing. For my part, I don't know what would. There's no spirit among the people in these here times. Bring something to eat and drink here. I'm disgusted with humanity."
"On what account?"
asked Mr Tappertit, who had been quenching his fiery face in a half-gallon can.
"Don't you consider this a good beginning, mister?"
"Give me security that it ain't a ending," rejoined the hangman. "When that soldier went down, we might have made London ours, but no, we stand and gape and look on. The justice, I wish he had had a bullet in each eye, as he would have had if we'd gone to work my way, says, 'My lads, if you'll give me your word to disperse, I'll order off the military.' Our people sets up a hurrah, throws up the game with the winning cards in their hands, and skulks away like a pack of tame curs as they are. Ah!" said the hangman in a tone of deep disgust. "It makes me blush for my fellow creeturs. I wish I'd been born a ox, I do."
"You'd have been quite as agreeable a character if you had been, I think," returned Simon Tappertit, going out in a lofty manner.
"Don't be too sure of that,"
rejoined the hangman, calling after him.
"If I was a horned animal at the present moment, with the smallest grain of sense, I'd toss every man in this company, excepting them two,"
meaning Hugh and Barnaby,
"for his manner of conducting himself this day.
With which mournful review of their proceedings, Mr Dennis sought consolation in cold boiled beef and beer, but without at all relaxing the grim and dissatisfied expression of his face, the gloom of which was rather deepened than dissipated by their grateful influence. The company who were thus libelled might have retaliated by strong words, if not by blows, but they were dispirited and worn out. The greater part of them had fasted since morning, all had suffered extremely from the excessive heat, and between the day's shouting, exertion, and excitement, many had quite lost their voices, and so much of their strength that they could hardly stand. Then they were uncertain what to do next, fearful of the consequences of what they had done already, and sensible that after all they had carried no point, but had indeed left matters worse than they had found them. Of those who had come to the boot, many dropped off within an hour, such of them as were really honest and sincere, never after the morning's experience to return, or to hold any communication with their late companions. Others remained but to refresh themselves, and then went home desponding. Others, who had theretofore been regular in their attendance, avoided the place altogether. The half-dozen prisoners whom the guards had taken were magnified by report into 100 at least, and their friends, being faint and sober, so slackened in their energy, and so drooped beneath these dispiriting influences, that by 8 o'clock in the evening, Dennis, Hugh, and Barnaby were left alone. Even they were fast asleep upon the benches, when Gashford's entrance roused them.
"Oh, you are here, then?" said the secretary. "Dear me!"
"Why, where should we be, Muster Gashford?" Dennis rejoined, as he rose into a sitting posture.
"Oh, nowhere, nowhere," he returned with excessive mildness. "The streets are filled with blue cockades. I rather thought you might have been among them. I am glad you are not."
"You have orders for us, master, then?" said Hugh.
"Oh dear, no, not I. No orders, my good fellow. What orders should I have? You are not in my service."
"Muster Gashford," remonstrated Dennis, "we belong to the cause, don't we?"
"The cause?"
repeated the secretary, looking at him in a sort of abstraction.
"There is no cause. The cause is lost."
"Lost?"
"Oh, yes. You have heard, I suppose. The petition is rejected by 192 to 6. It's quite final. We might have spared ourselves some trouble. That and my lord's vexation are the only circumstances I regret. I am quite satisfied in all other respects."
As he said this, he took a penknife from his pocket, and putting his hat upon his knee, began to busy himself in ripping off the blue cockade which he had worn all day, at the same time humming a psalm tune which had been very popular in the morning, and dwelling on it with a gentle regret. His two adherents looked at each other, and at him, as if they were at a loss how to pursue the subject. At length Hugh, after some elbowing and winking between himself and Mr Dennis, ventured to stay his hand, and to ask him why he meddled with that riband in his hat.
"Because,"
said the secretary, looking up with something between a snarl and a smile,
"because to sit still and wear it, or to fall asleep and wear it, is a mockery. That's all, friend."
"What would you have us do, master?" cried Hugh.
"Nothing,"
returned Gashford, shrugging his shoulders.
"Nothing. When my lord was reproached and threatened for standing by you, I, as a prudent man, would have had you do nothing. When the soldiers were trampling you under their horses' feet, I would have had you do nothing. When one of them was struck down by a daring hand, and I saw confusion and dismay in all their faces, I would have had you do nothing. Just what you did, in short. This is the young man who had so little prudence and so much boldness. Ah, I am sorry for him."
"Sorry, master?" cried Hugh. "Sorry, Muster Gashford?" echoed Dennis.
In case there should be a proclamation out to-morrow, offering £500 or some such trifle for his apprehension, and in case it should include another man who dropped into the lobby from the stairs above,' said Gashford coldly, 'still do nothing.' 'Fire and fury, master!' cried Hugh, starting up. 'What have we done that you should talk to us like this?' 'Nothing,' returned Gashford with a sneer. 'If you are cast into prison, if the young man,' here he looked hard at Barnaby's attentive face, 'is dragged from us and from his friends, perhaps from people whom he loves and whom his death would kill, is thrown into jail, brought out and hanged before their eyes, still do nothing. You'll find it your best policy, I have no doubt.' 'Come on!' cried Hugh, striding towards the door. 'Dennis! Barnaby! Come on!' 'Where? You do what?' said Gashford, slipping past him, and standing with his back against it. 'Anywhere! Anything!' cried Hugh. 'Stand aside, master, or the window will serve our turn as well. Let us out.' 'You are of such an impetuous nature,' said Gashford, changing his manner for one of the utmost good fellowship and the pleasantest raillery. 'You are such an excitable creature. But you'll drink with me before you go?'
'Oh, yes, certainly,' growled Dennis, drawing his sleeve across his thirsty lips. 'No malice, brother. Drink with Muster Gashford.' Hugh wiped his heated brow and relaxed into a smile. The artful secretary laughed outright. 'Some liquor here. Be quick, or he'll not stop even for that. He is a man of such desperate ardour,' said the smooth secretary, whom Mr Dennis corroborated with sundry nods and muttered oaths. 'Once roused, he is a fellow of such fierce determination.' Hugh poised his sturdy arm aloft, and clapping Barnaby on the back, bade him fear nothing. They shook hands together, poor Barnaby evidently possessed with the idea that he was among the most virtuous and disinterested heroes in the world, and Gashford laughed again. 'I hear,' he said smoothly, as he stood among them with a great measure of liquor in his hand, and filled their glasses as quickly and as often as they chose, 'I hear, but I cannot say whether it be true or false, that the men who are loitering in the streets tonight are half disposed to pull down a Romish chapel or two, and that they only want leaders. I even heard mention of those in Duke Street, Lincoln's Inn Fields, and in Warwick Street, Golden Square. But common report, you know. You're not going?' 'To do nothing, master, eh?' cried Hugh. 'No jails and halter for Barnaby and me. They must be frightened out of that. Leaders are wanted, are they? Now, boys!' 'A most impetuous fellow!' cried the secretary. 'A courageous, boisterous, most vehement fellow. A man who—' There was no need to finish the sentence, for they had rushed out of the house and were far beyond hearing. He stopped in the middle of a laugh, listened, drew on his gloves, and, clasping his hands behind him, paced the deserted room for a long time, then bent his steps towards the busy town, and walked into the streets. They were filled with people, for the rumour of that day's proceedings had made a great noise. Those persons who did not care to leave home were at their doors or windows, and one topic of discourse prevailed on every side. Some reported that the riots were effectually put down, others that they had broken out again. Some said that Lord George Gordon had been sent under a strong guard to the Tower, others that an attempt had been made upon the king's life, that the soldiers had been again called out, and that the noise of musketry in a distant part of the town had been plainly heard within an hour. As it grew darker, these stories became more direful and mysterious, and often, when some frightened passenger ran past with tidings that the rioters were not far off, and were coming up, the doors were shut and barred, lower windows made secure,
and as much consternation engenders as if the city were invaded by a foreign army. Gashford walked stealthily about, listening to all he heard, and diffusing or confirming, whenever he had an opportunity, such false intelligence as suited his own purpose, and, busily occupied in this way, turned into Holborn for the 20th time, when a great many women and children came flying along the street, often panting and looking back, and the confused murmur of numerous voices struck upon his ear. Assured by these tokens, and by the red light which began to flash upon the houses on either side, that some of his friends were indeed approaching, he begged a moment's shelter at a door which opened as he passed, and running with some other persons to an upper window, looked out upon the crowd. They had torches among them, and the chief faces were distinctly visible. That they had been engaged in the destruction of some building was sufficiently apparent, and that it was a Catholic place of worship was evident from the spoils they bore as trophies, which were easily recognizable for the vestments of priests and rich fragments of altar furniture. Covered with soot and dirt and dust and lime, their garments torn to rags, their hair hanging wildly about them, their hands and faces jagged and bleeding with the wounds of rusty nails, Barnaby, Hugh, and Dennis hurried on before them all, like hideous madmen. After them the dense throng came fighting on, some singing, some shouting in triumph, some quarrelling among themselves, some menacing the spectators as they passed, some with great wooden fragments on which they spent their rage as if they had been alive, rending them limb from limb, and hurling the scattered morsels high into the air, some in a drunken state, unconscious of the hurts they had received from falling bricks and stones and beams, one borne upon a shutter, in the very midst, covered with a dingy cloth, a senseless, ghastly heap. Thus a vision of coarse faces, with here and there a blot of flaring, smoky light, a dream of demon heads, and savage eyes, and sticks, and iron bars, uplifted in the air and whirled about, a bewildering horror, in which so much was seen, and yet so little, which seemed so long, and yet so short, in which there were so many phantoms, not to be forgotten all through life, and yet so many things that could not be observed in one distracting glimpse. It flitted onward, and was gone. As it passed away upon its work of wrath and ruin, a piercing scream was heard. A knot of persons ran towards the spot. Gashford, who just then emerged into the street among them. He was on the outskirts of the little concourse, and could not see or hear what passed within, but one who had a better place informed him that a widow woman had descried her son among the rioters.
"Is that all?" said the secretary, turning his face homewards. "Well, I think this looks a little more like business."
End of chapter 50.